LoveLore Library. Chapter 254. My dear wife Madam Chu, treat this letter like my person. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. After noticing Senior Servant Lu's expectant expression, Chu Lian could only tear open the letter on the spot. As expected, there was a thick stack of paper within. Chu Lian didn't know what to expect. She had never received a reply from He Sanlang before. If it was anything like those ghastly brushstrokes of his last time, it would be a miracle if she could make out what he wrote. Chu Lian took out the papers from the envelope and prepared herself for some major squinting and headaches to make out He Sanlang's terrible writing. However, when she looked at the letters, it seemed like he had actually put effort into his writing this time. The brushstrokes on the paper looked beautiful and refined, yet bold and powerful at the same time. To my dear wife Madam Chu, treat this letter like my person. Chu Lian's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she calmed down and continued reading. There were actually 8 whole sheets of paper in this very thick letter. Although Senior Servant Lu couldn't see what was written on the papers, she could see that each sheet was covered in writing. Her eyes curved upwards in a smile. It looked like Third Young Master had a lot to say to Third Young Madam. Those servants outside were all blind. How dare they say that Third Young Master and his wife weren't on good terms with each other? How could they say that Third Young Master had gone to join the army at the northern border because he wasn't happy with this marriage that the old matriarch had gotten for him? Look at this thick stack of papers. If those people dared to continue speaking nonsense like that, she was going to smack them in the face with this letter. He Sanlang had written a lot in this letter. It took Chu Lian 15 whole minutes to finish reading it all. When she lifted her gaze from the paper, she was met with Senior Servant Lu's bright, sparkling eyes. The old servant practically had the words, "Tell me what he wrote," written on her forehead. Chu Lian felt a little embarrassed and very put on the spot. She didn't know what to tell Senior Servant Lu. Did she really have to tell Senior Servant Lu that He Sanlang had questioned why she had sent him an envelope full of blank papers? That he had said she didn't deserve to be his wife since she hadn't put in full care and consideration for him. He had also complained that she hadn't sent anything for him in the previous package. Her husband was fighting hard in the far-off northern border, yet she hadn't even sent him proper clothes and shoes or socks. Furthermore, she hadn't sent any of the beef jerky and grape wine that she had sent the last time. He Sanlang even added on that she shouldn't think too highly of herself even though she was already an honored lady personally named by the emperor. An honored lady was just a 5th rank title. If she wanted a greater noble rank in the future, she would still have to depend on him, her useless husband. When Chu Lian had first started reading, she did get a little angry at his words. However, as she continued reading on, she couldn't help but find it funny instead. When she looked carefully at what he wrote again, why did it seem like his bold brushstrokes carried a sour trace to them? Chu Lian rolled her eyes. This crazy husband of hers, He Sanlang, was being a hypocrite. Right after they had gotten married, he had completely changed into a different person and left her all alone in the estate without any warning at all. Now he suddenly turned around and was trying to dictate her life. What gave him that right? Just look at what this guy had written at the end of his letter. Madam Chu, as my wife, what are you doing cooking for other people all day? Remember what a wife is supposed to do. Could she just translate these words into, you're not allowed to cook for anyone else but me? Otherwise I'm going to get mad. Chu Lian rolled her eyes and didn't take He Changdi's words to heart at all. He Sanlang was far off at the northern border. How was he going to do anything to her from that distance? However, she hadn't expected that He Sanlang would get promoted to captain this quickly. She actually admired him for his ability due to this. It wasn't easy to rise through the ranks in the army, especially during peacetime and in such a short amount of time, too. Not only that, but Great General Qian was known to be a strict commander as well. It looked like the hints she had drawn for He Sanlang the last time had come into play. Chu Lian was still in the dark about her unintentional involvement in He Changdi's promotion. Chu Lian coughed awkwardly before reporting to senior servant Lu, "My husband wrote that he's already a captain of the infantry in the Northern Border Army. He has a 6th-ranked military title now." That's great news. This old servant has to report this to the matriarch immediately." After saying so, senior servant Lu quickly got up and rushed all the way back to Qingxi Hall with the people she had brought with her. Chu Lian helplessly wiped away her sweat. At least she had somehow gotten senior servant Lu out of here. Otherwise, she really didn't know how she was going to explain the rest of the letter to the wise senior servant. However, it seemed like senior servant Lu hadn't been acting in her reaction just now. Hadn't He Sanlang reported his promotion in his letter to grandmother? But why? Could it be that he was aiming much higher and thought that a small captain rank wasn't worth mentioning? Then why had he talked about it in his letter to her? Furthermore, he had even emphasized his newly gotten rank to her. Chu Lian thought hard and finally arrived at a possible conclusion. Could her honored lady title have aggravated him somehow? Was He Sanlang trying to show off to her that he had a bright future ahead as well? That any future noble titles of hers would be up to him to bestow on her? Chu Lian shook her head and smiled. This sudden thought was just too silly. He Sanlang clearly didn't like her at all, judging by how he had treated her after marriage. If he could divorce her without any reason at all, he probably wouldn't even take a minute to make a decision. How could a man who treated her like that suddenly think of her in that way? The corners of her lips tugged downwards. She wasn't supposed to think about all this. It was better to just be a layabout who didn't need to care about annoying things like this. Xian was watching her master's expression change with an uneasy heart. She didn't know what third young madam was thinking about. Chapter 255, My Dear Wife Madam Chu, Treat This Letter Like My Person. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. The day after tomorrow was Countess Jingyan's birthday. Her birthday landed right after the autumn examinations ended, so the results would likely be posted on that day, as well. All these important events had been squeezed together for some reason. However, since House Jingyan was a military official family and none of their family members had taken part in the examinations, they wouldn't need to bother with the results. They would most likely hear about the top 3 scholars later and discuss it for a moment before forgetting about it. However, Chu Lian knew that the top scholar for the autumn examinations was going to be Xiao Bojian, the original male lead of the story. That scheming, ambitious man was going to use this result to transform himself and secure a seat at court. As much as Chu Lian didn't want to see that happen, she had no way to stop it either. There was a limit to her ability, and Xiao Bojian had a mysterious power backing him. She hadn't finished reading the book. Up to where she had stopped, the author had only mentioned that Xiao Bojian had a powerful force backing him, but hadn't revealed more details about it. As her thoughts led up to here, Chu Lian wanted to smash her bed out of regret and frustration. Why hadn't she read the ending before starting the book? Her half-baked knowledge of the events of the book was now making her uneasy. She didn't know what Xiao Bojian was going to do later on. However, since she didn't know what was going to happen, she could only take it one step at a time. At least she still had a general understanding of the near future, so she didn't have to worry too much for now. The day before Countess Jingyan's birthday. It was coming close to winter in the capital. Cold winds blew past like knives gliding across people's cheeks. The north wind was blowing in the courtyard, but the bedroom in Qingxi Hall was as warm as spring thanks to the underground heating. By this time, Matriarch He had already woken up and was in the midst of having breakfast. While drinking some warm tea, she chatted with Senior Servant Lu and Muxiang. Senior Servant Lu was squatting down and massaging Matriarch He's legs. Matriarch, you should have seen how sweet third young master and third young madam are with each other. Third young master wrote a letter this thick for third young madam. She even spread her thumb and index finger wide to illustrate her point. This old servant was just sitting next to third young madam and watching her read the letter. Third young madam read through that letter at least 7 times over. Oh my, this Sanlang. He's finally realizing how good his wife is after leaving for the north. That's fine, the two of them are still young. Once Sanlang remembers this suffering, the two of them will be even closer after he comes back. Matriarch, he had still been a little unwell over the past few days. However, after receiving a letter from her youngest grandson yesterday, her spirit had returned, along with her smiles. She looked both cheerful and energetic today, and her pallor seemed to have improved. Senior servant Lu knew that Matriarch he was the most worried about He Changdi out of all her grandsons, so she took the chance to try to cheer Matriarch he up with some news. What else could make Matriarch he happy other than good news about the youngest couple of their family? When Madame Zhou arrived at the entrance of the bedroom with her daughters in hand, she heard the sounds of laughter from within. Madame Zhou frowned. In this month, she had actually slimmed down quite a bit. Her originally slightly plump cheeks were now sunken in on her face, making her look much older than she actually was. She gritted her teeth with a spark of unhappiness in her eyes. Her mother-in-law's birthday was almost here and she was the one who had to take care of all the matters related to it as the lady in charge of the household. She was so busy that she barely had any time to rest. It was already bad enough that the matriarch wasn't helping her, but look at what was happening in her courtyard. They were laughing so loudly, it was like they had forgotten their manners. Little En and Little Lin trembled in their mother's grip. Their expressions seemed a little strained, as if they could sense their mother's unhappiness. The maidservant watching the door helped Madame Zhou lift the curtains covering the entrance and Madame Zhou led her 2 little ones into the warm room. When they caught sight of the affable matriarch Little En and Little Lin immediately broke free from their mother's hands and ran towards the matriarch. Matriarch chuckled and lifted the 2 children to sit on either side of her. She then patted their heads. Little En and Little Lin have come. Was it cold outside? Little En tugged at her little sister's hand and secretly glanced at Madame Zhou before shaking her head obediently. Little En isn't cold at all. Little En wanted to come and see great-grandmother earlier. My Little En's the best. Matriarch he quickly carried the 6-year-old Little En and hugged her. Since the matriarch's health had just recovered, senior servant Lu was afraid that the weight of Little En might hurt the matriarch's body. She quickly shot a look at the 2 nursemaids standing by and the 2 nursemaids hurried forward to carry the children away to play. It was only after Madame Zhou had finished watching matriarch he bond with her 2 children that she stepped forward to greet the matriarch. Granddaughter-in-law greets grandmother. Matriarch he waved away the formality and instructed her granddaughter-in-law to take a seat. It's getting colder outside now. Little En and Little Lin are still young and they're just little girls. Their bodies are frail, so you don't have to bring them to greet me every day. Let the 2 children sleep a little more. These words were just matriarchy's way of caring for her great-granddaughters, but they seemed to hold a different meaning in Madame Zhou's mind. Her expression stiffened and she replied, "That wouldn't be good, grandmother. Although they're young, they're still your legitimate great-granddaughters. Greeting you in the morning is part of their duties." Chapter 256, Targeting Gillen Restaurant. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Matriarch he stiffened imperceptibly and turned towards Dalong's wife, who was sitting not too far away with her head down. Even though they met every day, why did she have the feeling that Dalong's wife had changed a lot recently? How could Matriarch he have missed that hidden meaning in Madame Zhou's words? Dalong's wife was afraid that the 2 little ones had lost favor with her and was trying to make sure that she wouldn't forget about the existence of the 2 young girls. Unfortunately, Madame Zhou hadn't understood her kind intentions at all. Her heart was only filled with thoughts of fighting for favor. Matriarchy's earlier good mood completely dissipated. Do as you like. Make sure that the servants keep a watch on the girl's health. The weather outside is so cold now, so make sure they put on more layers and bring a hand warmer with them when going out. Granddaughter-in-law understands. Matriarchy picked up her teacup and took a sip before she said, "It's your mother's birthday tomorrow. How are the preparations going?" "Rest assured, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law has already ordered the servants to prepare everything. There won't be any accidents tomorrow. This old woman is already getting on in age and your mother's health still isn't what it was. It's been hard on you all these years." Madame Zhou almost cried out upon hearing these words of praise from matriarchy. Wasn't it so? She was the only one managing this huge estate. How could it possibly be easy? She had to get up early in the morning before the sun rose and listen to the daily reports from all the stewards of the estate, arrange for servants where needed, and even had to mind the relationships between the people in the estate. It could be said that this great Jing'an estate wouldn't be able to function without her. Madame Zhou felt even more aggrieved upon thinking about all this and sunk even further into her self-pity. Tears leaked out of her eyes, already beyond her control. As long as grandmother understands granddaughter-in-law's hardships, then this bit of labor is nothing to granddaughter-in-law. All right, stop crying, don't spoil your eyes by crying too much. If you have any hardships, you can tell grandmother directly. Madame Zhou was still choked up with tears as she looked up at matriarchy with wet eyes. Grandmother, since you asked, granddaughter-in-law won't keep it from you anymore. Granddaughter-in-law does have a matter to discuss with grandmother. Matriarchy was slightly stunned. She hadn't expected that Madame Zhou would really take her up on her offer. What is it? Just say it out directly. There's nothing you have to hide from me. Madame Zhou hesitated before finally gathering the courage to speak. Grandmother, mother's medical expenses. I'm afraid our estate's public accounts can no longer afford them. A single month of Countess Jing'an's medicine cost at least 1,000 taels. The monthly income for House Jing'an's public accounts was merely 1 to 2,000 taels. Furthermore, Madame Zhou wasn't good at business management, and the managers of the stores and properties they had were appropriating funds for themselves. It was getting harder and harder to keep this noble estate afloat. Countess Jing'an had previously paid for her own medicine, and her expenses had only shifted to the shared accounts just 2 months ago. After less than 3 months, the estate's funds were already dwindling. Matriarchy hadn't expected that their estate's funds would be exhausted so quickly. Her brows drew together in a frown and she was about to speak when a maidservant announced the arrival of third young madam. Even though the matriarch had been interrupted, she wasn't angry at all. Instead, her expression turned cheerful. Quick, invite Sanlang's wife in. It's cold outside. The thick curtains covering the entrance of the heated room were pulled aside by the maidservant standing outside, and Chu Lian crouched slightly to enter the room. Since Chu Lian's noble title had been bestowed by the Qingping Emperor himself, she could be counted as part of the imperial family. Thus, the palace's Department of Textiles had sent Chu Lian 2 outfits when they prepared winter clothing for the imperial family. There was a lovely light vermilion court dress and a simpler teal dress with auspicious pictures embroidered over it. There were 12 pictures of flowers embroidered on each dress, and the design was both complicated and beautiful at the same time. This standard of craftsmanship was as expected from the department in charge of clothing the imperial family. Today, Chu Lian was wearing that bluish-green dress with a flared skirt. Her slender hands were stuffed into a snow-white sleeve made of rabbit fur. She only wore a single white jade hairpin on her head, and the rest of her black hair was left cascading down her back with some strands resting on the fluffy white fur collar of her dress. She looked like a cute, obedient little bunny in this getup. If not for the fact that her hair was done up in a married madam's hairstyle, one might think that she was a young noble maiden who had just come of age. "Granddaughter-in-law has come to greet grandmother," Chu Lian cheerfully called out as she entered the room. Matriarch he felt happy just seeing Chu Lian's smooth as porcelain, doll-like face with a smile. "What are you doing coming here so early on such a cold day? Come, sit next to grandmother." Chu Lian bobbed towards Madame Zhou before sitting next to Matriarch He. The matriarch ordered senior servant Lu to give Chu Lian a cup of warm honey water. She knew her little granddaughter-in-law didn't like to drink sincha, unlike most people. Madame Zhou watched coldly as matriarch He unconsciously showed loving care and consideration for Chu Lian. The hands under her sleeves curled into fists. Madame Zhou suppressed her jealousy and waited until Chu Lian had been given a warm cup of honey water. Only then did she say, "Grandmother, about that matter that granddaughter-in-law mentioned earlier," reminded of the pressing problem at hand by Madame Zhou, matriarchy's expression turned serious. "It was my fault for not considering this matter more carefully. However, I seem to remember that we should have at least 3,000 taels of income from the shop fronts in our estate's accounts. 3,000 taels were more than enough to sustain the estate's monthly expenses, even after taking away Countess Jingyan's medicine fees." Madame Zhou's lips parted, but she hesitated to speak. Finally, she used her remaining courage to say, "Grandmother, that was the situation 5 years ago. It can't be compared to the situation now." Madame Zhou suddenly shot a glance in Chu Lian's direction. When she saw that her sister-in-law had her head lowered and was drinking some honey water instead, a spark of dissatisfaction flashed through her heart. Granddaughter-in-law doesn't have a single store in hand that can compare to third sister-in-law's Gillen restaurant. Chapter 257, Targeting Gillen Restaurant, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian wasn't in charge of managing the estate and had no desire to take up the responsibility either. She had just been drinking her water and doing her best to become one with the background. Why had this eldest sister-in-law of hers suddenly shifted the topic to her instead? Chu Lian's hands froze while in the midst of holding up her cup. However, she knew it wasn't a good time to speak and remained silent. Matriarchy's brows furrowed together. How could the estate's income have shrunken so fast? When given the rights to manage the properties of their noble estates, the madams of other estates would likely develop the properties in their hands further and bring in more income. However, look at Dalong's wife. Not only had their businesses stagnated, but their income had even shrunk by half. How was she managing the estate's properties? After Madame Zhou spoke, she did feel a little guilty. She had appropriated some funds to plump up her dowry and house Ding Yuan's second branch after becoming the lady in charge of the estate. Otherwise, the estate's income couldn't have declined so fast. In the beginning, Gillen Restaurant hadn't been Chu Lian's property, rather, it had been part of the matriarch's dowry. Madame Zhou only saw the vast profits that Gillen Restaurant was bringing in now, but had never thought of the reason, or person, behind Gillen Restaurant's success. If not for Chu Lian, then Gillen Restaurant would still be hidden away in the Old West Market and making a loss. After hearing Madame Zhou's words, Matriarchy was stunned for a moment. When she recovered from her daze, she said, "Dalong's wife, what are you thinking about now?" Madame Zhou took a deep breath and pinched herself under her sleeves. She gathered up her courage to say, "After all this time, granddaughter-in-law has finally seen that third sister-in-law has a good hand at managing businesses. We're all House Jingyan's granddaughters-in-law, so third sister-in-law should put some responsibility on her shoulders, too. Since third sister-in-law has the capability, why don't we move Gillen Restaurant into our estate's public accounts? If grandmother thinks that this is doing a disservice to third sister-in-law, I can move out some other properties from the public accounts as compensation. Since third sister-in-law is so skilled, I'm sure those properties can become the next Gillen restaurant in less than 2 months. Once Madame Zhou finished speaking, it was not only Chu Lian, but even Matriarch He and Senior Servant Lu who were shocked. A glint flashed through Chu Lian's wide almond-shaped eyes. Chu Lian inwardly sneered. She hadn't expected that Madame Zhou would try to pull such a trick on her here. It seemed like she had set her sights on Gillen restaurant and was already green-eyed with envy. What a pity that Matriarch He had already handed over the deeds and documents for Gillen restaurant to her a few days ago. Gillen restaurant was now completely hers. It was useless for Madame Zhou to ask for it from Matriarch He. If she wanted Gillen restaurant, Madame Zhou should be pleading her for it instead. Chu Lian lowered her gaze and continued her silence with a calm expression, as if Madame Zhou's words had nothing to do with her, as if Madame Zhou wasn't trying to steal the property in her hands right in front of Matriarch He. Matriarch He and Senior Servant Lu turned to look at Chu Lian at the same time. The furrow between Matriarch He's brows grew even deeper. Dalong's wife, what are you saying? I've already told you that I've given Gillen restaurant to Liener. You were present then and you didn't say anything. Why are you trying to ask for it back now? This isn't appropriate. Furthermore, I've already given Liener the deed to Gillen restaurant. Madame Zhou's expression changed abruptly. Grandmother, if we have this Gillen restaurant in the estate's public accounts, we won't have to worry about mother's medicine fees any longer. What's more, third sister-in-law is capable in this respect. All right, you don't have to say any more. I've already made my decision. Since you said that the public funds can no longer accommodate your mother's monthly medical expenses, then I'll pay for half of it from my own private funds. The remaining half will be paid for with the public funds. This wasn't the result that Madame Zhou wanted. What she wanted was Chu Lian's Gillen restaurant. That was the real golden goose. If she managed to get it in hand, that meant that she would own all of Gillen restaurant's secret recipes. By then, she could even open up 10 restaurants like Gillen if she wanted to. Wouldn't she be rolling in riches then? Just as Madame Zhou was getting antsy and trying to come up with her next plan, Chu Lian suddenly spoke up. I didn't know that eldest sister-in-law and grandmother were worried over this matter. Grandmother, let granddaughter-in-law pay for mother's medicine expenses instead. Granddaughter-in-law's Gillen restaurant has indeed earned quite a sum last month. Since granddaughter-in-law has the ability to do so, granddaughter-in-law should support the estate in this manner. It's also mother's medicine expenses we're talking about here. Since Sanlang isn't around, this is all granddaughter-in-law can do for the estate. Granddaughter-in-law hopes that grandmother and eldest sister-in-law will accept this small effort. Chu Lian had been intending to act as a silent prop in the background and drink her favorite honey water while listening to grandmother and eldest sister-in-law chat about family matters. However, since Madame Zhou was trying to plot against her, she wouldn't simply lie back and take it. She wasn't someone to be bullied. She hadn't really wanted to say something like this at first, but the situation had forced her hand. Bringing up the matter of Countess Jing'an's medicine fees in front of Matriarch He was already reflecting rather badly upon Madame Zhou. However, later on, without offering to pay for her mother-in-law's medicine herself, she had even tried to snatch away Gillen restaurant, her sister-in-law's only property. Those high-sounding words she had used to pave the way beforehand were just that, grand yet empty. How could Matriarch He not detect the selfish motives in Madame Zhou's words? Despite that, Chu Lian had readily agreed to this when Madame Zhou was completely unwilling to do so. She was even going to pay for her mother-in-law's expenses. With this comparison, it was easy to tell who was the better person. Madame Zhou had been left completely in the dust. Besides that, Chu Lian was originally a poor miss without much in her dowry, so this comparison stood out even more. Madame Zhou's face turned a different color and shifted through all sorts of expressions. Chapter 258, Birthday. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian's offer was completely out of matriarchy's expectations. She stiffened for a moment in surprise before tears began to gather in the corners of her eyes. She knew roughly how much Gillen Restaurant earned in a month. Manager Qin had previously been one of her servants, after all. She also knew that Dalong's wife had brought up that idea purely out of jealousy. In order for their family to stand on stable feet, the inner court had to be at peace or in balance. The matriarch was gratified that Chu Lian was able to make such an offer for the greater good. At the same time, she lamented how much Madame Zhou had changed. In the end, she made the final decision. Sanlang's wife, since you have the heart to do so, you'll be the one to pay for your mother's medicine fees from now on. However, only do so within your own capability and don't push yourself too hard. No matter what happens to you afterwards, you still have this old woman here to support you. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes turned upwards in a smile. Granddaughter-in-law understands. I won't be too shy to ask for help from grandmother. Matriarchy dwelled in thought for a moment before turning to Madame Zhou and telling her, Dalong's wife, this old woman did not expect the family's shared properties to have declined to this state. The blame for this can't be placed on your shoulders, since you didn't have a capable steward to help you manage these properties. I gave Sanlang's wife a manager before, so I'll send you one as well. He'll help you with managing the estate's properties. Madame Zhou looked up in shock right after Matriarchy finished speaking. Her lips trembled and parted as the urge to reject this arrangement flooded her being. However, when she met Matriarchy's sharp old eyes, any hope of struggling faded away. It seemed like Matriarchy had already detected those small tricks she had pulled with the estate's properties beforehand, but the matriarch hadn't bothered to stop it due to her trust in her. Now that she was starting to target the third branch with her schemes, Matriarchy naturally wouldn't continue letting her greed run free. Now that Matriarchy had placed a manager by her side with a completely upright reason, she probably wouldn't be able to continue appropriating funds in secret. Madame Zhou was filled with regret. Not only had she failed to steal Gillen Restaurant, but she had even lost her source of income to boot. When Matriarchy saw that Madame Zhou was choosing to remain silent and was simply looking downwards at the floor, the matriarch frowned and raised her voice with an unhappy tone. Dalong's wife, did you hear me? Madame Zhou's body shook once. Matriarchy's rage showed clearly through her voice. Granddaughter-in-law, he heard you. Matriarchy had already been feeling unwell these past 2 days. After facing such a huge problem in the morning thanks to Madame Zhou, her head was starting to ache. Alright, since there's nothing else to discuss, all of you should return. Bring Little N and Little Lin back with you too. Madame Zhou was currently feeling very low, so she left quickly with her 2 daughters. Chu Lian was 1 step behind her. Just as she was about to step out of Qingxi Hall's entrance, someone with a clear voice called out from behind. Third young madam, please wait. Chu Lian paused and turned back to look, only to see Matriarchy's handmaid Muxiang and a few maidservants carrying some exquisite wood boxes. Muxiang hurried over in 2 strides. Third young madam, the weather has turned cold, so the matriarch has sent this servant over to escort you to Songtao Court. Thus, with Muxiang supporting her arm on one side and chatting to her, Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court. Following that, Muxiang instructed the maidservants behind her to place the brocade-lined boxes on the parlor's table. These are some rewards that the Empress Dowager bestowed upon the matriarch. There's a handsome white fox fur coat within. It's quite a rare treasure due to its purity. The matriarch said that a white fur coat like this wouldn't suit her at her age, but it will fit third young madam perfectly. There are also a few brand new exquisite ruby and sapphire accessories. The matriarch ordered this servant to bring these over to third young madam as well because they'll go along perfectly with the outfits the palace sent over for you. Chu Lian accepted the gifts and had senior servant Zhong send Muxiang off. She returned to her own little study, knowing very well that these gifts were matriarchy's way of compensating her. She had taken a look at that white fox coat earlier. It was brand new and hadn't even been worn, so it was indeed a rather expensive gift. If not for that ruckus today, this fox coat would most likely have been given to that sister-in-law of hers, Madame Zhou. Of course, the reason Chu Lian knew this was because she had read about it in the story before. However, due to her arrival, she had changed some of the events. Just as Chu Lian was about to sink into her thoughts, Wenlan came in to pass a message. Third young madam, Manager Qin has come over. He's waiting in the parlor outside. Chu Lian stood up to meet Manager Qin. In less than 15 minutes, they were done with the meeting and Manager Qin left. Senior servant Gue had been standing behind Chu Lian during the meeting. She had a bewildered expression on her face as she asked, "Third young madam, what is this about?" Just now, she had watched as Chu Lian gave Manager Qin a letter and listed out 3 questions. Manager Qin was to put up these 3 questions at the entrance of Gillen Restaurant with a notice to announce that anyone who could answer all 3 questions correctly would get a free meal at Gillen Restaurant. Chu Lian smiled mysteriously. "Don't worry, Momo. It's not anything bad. It'll be a surprise." Senior servant Gue was even more confused. She couldn't even start to guess at what her master was trying to do now. Nonetheless, with Chu Lian's guarantee, senior servant Gue felt reassured. Chapter 259, Birthday, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. In the afternoon, someone from the outer court came to ask Chu Lian for her reply to He Changdi's letter. The manservant who had come was senior servant Lu's son, who was working in the outer court. Actually, Chu Lian had already prepared the letter and the accompanying package yesterday. If not for the huge package that third young madam's maidservants were carrying, the manservant would have already tried to hint at how the letter seemed to be a little too thin. When he held it in his hands, it was almost as light as a feather. Looking at how thin it was, there was most likely only a single sheet of paper inside. Didn't third young madam have any sweet nothings to say to third young master? Third young master's letter had been so much thicker. As the manservant carried the package on his back and left Songtao Court, his lips were pressed together tightly. This letter was way too thin. How was he going to report this to his mother later? Wasn't third young madam way too relaxed? Wasn't she worried that third young master would fall for other women while he was away? Even though she had been given the chance, she hadn't tried to bond more with her husband. Third young madam was still too young. If this manservant were to find out how He Sanlang had been passing his days at the northern border, he probably wouldn't be thinking like that. Once House Jing'an's letters and packages had been sent to Prince Jin, they still had to be brought to the northern border through Prince Jin's connections before they could reach He Sanlang's hands. In Prince Jin's study, he was currently pacing about in the room with his hands behind his back. His uncommon azure eyes were shining under the light of the candles illuminating the space. After a short moment's wait, the sound of footsteps could be heard from outside the study. When the footsteps stopped, a rough voice called out, "This subordinate greets Prince Jin. Enter." A man carrying a sword at his waist, dressed in a black robe that flared widely at the ends, entered the room. He walked straight up to Prince Jin's side. "Have you carried out the tasks that this prince has entrusted to you?" The square-faced man tensed and knelt down on one knee next to Prince Jin. "This subordinate is useless. This subordinate hasn't found the person that your highness is searching for." Prince Jin sighed and walked over to his desk. He took a seat and picked up the small brush that had already been dipped in ink. Then, he set the brush to paper with vigorous and lively movements. After a few moments, he lifted his brush and let the paper dry before inserting it into an envelope. He placed the letter into the package from House Jing'an and stood up before giving orders to the man in black. Send this to the Eagle team. They'll know what to do. As for the other matter this prince has entrusted to you, continue investigating. You must find that person as soon as you can. After the black-robed man left with the letter and package, Prince Jean sat back down behind his desk with his brows drawn together. Even though He Changdi was one of his most trusted brothers, he still found it hard to believe what He Changdi had written in his letter. Countess Jing'an had been ill for more than 20 years. Could that wandering traveler called Miao really treat her sickness? Of course, Prince Jean didn't know that it was this great Dr. Miao who had been the one to treat the Qingping Emperor when he had been afflicted with an incurable illness in He Changdi's past life. Xiao Bojian had been the one to recommend this doctor to treat the emperor, extending the emperor's life for 5 more years. Later on, when Count Jing'an had met this great Dr. Miao, he had described his, by then deceased, wife's symptoms to this doctor. Great Dr. Miao had then personally declared that Countess Jing'an's illness could be cured completely. After treatment, her body would simply be a little weaker than most. Back then, when the newly returned Count Jing'an had learned of this news, he had locked himself in his study for 3 whole days and nights. It was also due to this abnormal action from Count Jing'an that the He family had all learned that Countess Jing'an's illness could have been treated. They simply hadn't been able to meet the right doctor at the right time. The 10th of October was Countess Jing'an's 45th birthday. Although it didn't mark the end of another decade of life, it was about halfway. Additionally, Countess Jing'an's health had always been rather poor. Her situation had also been getting worse in the recent months, perhaps due to the lower quality of medicinal herbs or some other reason. These few days, she hadn't been able to get up from bed at all. Matriarchy was extremely worried. Her son and his wife were very close. However, her son was currently guarding the border at Mingzhou. If anything were to happen to his wife, he wouldn't even be able to meet her one last time. What were they going to do in that case? What's more, it wasn't just Count Jing'an who was far away from the estate. There was also that little rebel Sanlang out there. Matriarchy wanted to use Countess Jing'an's birthday as a chance to celebrate and cheer her up a little. However, she didn't send out many invites to the celebration. She only invited the noble madams and ladies that their house was closer to. She also sent a letter to her second grandson, He Changjue, who was still serving in the left military guards, asking him to return home that day for a meal. He Changjue normally stayed away from home out of fear that his senior family members would try to force him to marry. Thus, he usually stayed in the left military guard barracks even on rest days. However, this time, it was his mother's birthday. Of course, he wouldn't be able to avoid returning home. He switched shifts with one of his comrades and rushed home early on the day itself with his mother's birthday present. Chu Lian had already prepared her present much earlier. It was a pearl headdress that she had personally designed and specially requested one of Jinshi Pavilion's master craftsmen to make. Pearls were good for the health and suited Countess Jing'an more than those blinding precious stones. Furthermore, the headdress design that Chu Lian had come up with was completely new to the Great Wu dynasty. Fresh and elegant, they were most suited for a 45-year-old noble madam to wear. Royal Princess Duanjia was coming to the celebration today too. They had agreed on it beforehand. If she hadn't been afraid to steal the spotlight at Countess Jing'an's birthday banquet, Princess Wei would have also liked to come. Early in the morning, Royal Princess Duanjia was escorted to House Jing'an's entrance by her estate's guards. Chu Lu had said that she would personally cook breakfast for her if she arrived early. Even though Royal Princess Duanjia knew that Chu Lu was a foodie, she hadn't actually seen her cook with her own eyes yet. Royal Princess Duanjia had been waiting forever for this day. Thus, when getting off her carriage, she was a little rash in her actions. She tried to jump off the carriage before it had even come to a complete stop. In the next instant, all she could hear was the bellow of a horse as the world turned into a flurry of motion. TL note: the flared robe that the man in black is wearing is literally called the flying fish robe and looks like this, flying fish robe. Chapter 260, First Place, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Heartwarming innocently rode his handsome horse on his way back to the estate without any inkling of what was about to happen to him. After getting scolded by his superior yesterday, he then had to face a messenger sent by his grandmother to harry him into returning home for his mother's birthday. He had come out from his barracks on horseback early this morning with his heart filled with frustration. Thus, he had let his horse sprint all the way to the entrance of the estate before thinking to pull in the reins, only to see a low-key luxuriously decorated horse carriage come speeding over recklessly. Before the carriage even stopped, someone jumped out from the carriage and started on a collision course with his horse's belly. Heartwarming was pretty skilled in martial arts. With a twist of his waist, he reached out with his muscled arms and grabbed hold of the person about to fall out of the carriage. However, in order to do so, he had to kick off on his horse's side. The horse began to cry out from the immense pain it was feeling. It reared up and tried to shake Heartwarming off its back. Heartwarming's arms were wrapped around Royal Princess Duanjia. Upon realizing that he was about to fall off his horse, he could only twist his body again and roll off from the horse's back himself. However, he wasn't able to adjust his center of gravity properly and ended up in a position where he was going to fall onto Royal Princess Duanjia. Heartwarming suddenly realized that he was holding a fragile young lady in his arms. If he really fell right on top of her with his huge frame, wouldn't she be squashed flat? After that thought flashed through his mind, Heartwarming had already made his decision. He shifted his body slightly and let his broad back face the carriage. His toned arms tensed and pulled Royal Princess Duanjia into his embrace. Just as Royal Princess Duanjia was about to scream from fright, she heard the muffled thud of a body slamming against the side of the carriage. Finally, it was Heartwarming's broad back that hit the ground first. Royal Princess Duanjia was protected in his embrace, so all she suffered was some messy hair and disheveled clothing. Heartwarming felt a twinge of pain in his back, but his only reaction was a slightly furrowed brow. He quickly loosened the hold of his arms and asked in his deep and slightly husky voice, "Miss, are you all right? Have you been hurt?" It wasn't until she heard Heartwarming's caring words that Royal Princess Duanjia finally returned to her senses. She was still slightly dazed and completely forgot how to move, or even how to speak. She simply stared at the strong-looking man under her blankly. Your Highness, Your Highness. Are you all right?" Without waiting for Royal Princess Duanjia to finish regaining her wits, her servants had all come running over to her with pale faces. When one of her handmaids saw that the princess was still dazed and lying on top of a man's body, all the remaining color drained from her face. She quickly went over to help Royal Princess Duanjia up. "Your Highness, have you been hurt anywhere?" Royal Princess Duanjia subconsciously shook her head in reply. She allowed one of her handmaids, Jinshou, to straighten out her disheveled clothes with the help of another handmaid while she turned to look at the man who had just saved her. After hearing how the group of servants had addressed the girl he had just saved, Changjue was also slightly surprised. He hadn't expected that the person he had just saved would turn out to be a royal princess. When Royal Princess Duanjia had been helped up by those servants, Changjue had also gotten up onto his feet and dusted off his sleeves. His height wasn't noticeable while he was still lying on the ground. However, the moment he stood up, his head seemed to be a whole length higher than the ladies around him. Changjue looked both tall and strong, and the uniform of the left military guards only emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist. His skin was slightly tanned, and although his features weren't as fine as Changdi's, he gave off a firm and resolute aura. Just his mere presence was reassuring to the people around him. When Changjue noticed Royal Princess Duanjia looking up at him, he shifted his gaze away and bowed towards her. He apologized and said, "My name is Changjue of the left military guards." This humble one was terribly impolite towards your highness just now, but this humble one was forced to do so due to the circumstances. Please forgive this humble one, your highness. Royal Princess Duanjia kept staring at him silently. However, in her heart, she was now clear on He Changjua's identity. When she saw that this tall, strong man had to bend down and lower his head to her, that he didn't even dare to look at her, it was odd. The princess didn't feel the slightest bit inclined to blame He Changjue for the incident. Instead, the mischievous urge to keep watching his awkwardness rose up in her mind. When He Changjue didn't hear any response from the princess before him for a long while, he looked up a little and glanced at Royal Princess Duanjia. However, when he caught sight of the sly look in her eyes, He Changjue stiffened and felt even more uneasy. Jinxiu was getting more and more antsy just watching this. It wasn't good for them to continue standing like this in front of the Jing'an estate's main entrance. Today was Countess Jing'an's birthday, so there were definitely going to be more guests coming later on. Royal Princess Duanjia hid away the emotions in her eyes and purposely raised her chin to say, "Then this princess will forgive you just this once for your offense. There will be no next time." After finally getting a response from the princess, He Changjue inwardly heaved a sigh of relief. "Many thanks, your highness." Royal Princess Duanjia soon entered the Jing'an estate with her servants supporting her on either side and He Changjue following behind with some distance between them. Royal Princess Duanjia had thought that he would escort her to the parlor in the outer court at first, but He Erlang quickly turned and left on a different path after they entered the Jing'an estate. When she turned around, all she caught was his tall figure hurriedly leaving. Royal Princess Duanjia couldn't help but bite her lip in frustration. Following that, she went to Songtao Court to look for Chu Lian. Chapter 261, First Place, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian knew that Royal Princess Duanjia was going to come early today, so she was in the middle of cooking some chicken porridge for the princess. She ordered Xian to make more crystal buns since Royal Princess Duanjia liked them, and then retreated from the kitchen back to her bedroom to change into another outfit. Right after she finished changing, she heard some noise from Songtao Court's entrance. Royal Princess Duanjia immediately told Chu Lian all about what had happened to her just now, giving Chu Lian a huge fright. How lucky that second brother had come back to the estate at the right time. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been good if Royal Princess Duanjia had really fallen. She instructed Wenqing and Wenlan to bring Royal Princess Duanjia to another room to wash up a little and change out of her clothes before the two of them sat down to have breakfast. Royal Princess Duanjia pouted. "Chu Lu, I missed the chance to watch you cook for me again." Chu Lian rolled her eyes speechlessly. "Princess, isn't it good enough if you get to eat the results of my cooking? Why do you want to watch me cook? Don't tell me that you're trying to learn how to cook yourself. If you want to learn how to cook, it's easy enough. I'll just write out some of my recipes for you and you can get one of your estate's cooks to teach you." Royal Princess Duanjia quickly shook her head. "I'm not trying to learn how to cook. That's too troublesome. If I want to eat something good, I'll just come look for you. Anyway, I can come at any time and you'll cook for me regardless, right, Chu Lu? Then why do you want to watch me cook?" "I'm just curious. I want to see how you made all these delicacies step by step." Chu Lian didn't know what to say at all about Royal Princess Duanjia's strange liking. Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly reached out with her chopsticks and pointed at the crystal buns and crystal dumplings in front of her. "Chu Lu, you haven't made these for He Sanlang to eat before, have you?" Chu Lian wasn't sure why Royal Princess Duanjia had suddenly asked such a question, but she shook her head honestly. Strictly speaking, it seemed like He Changdi had only eaten her wontons and scallion pancakes before. And that beef jerky she had sent. Now that she thought about it, he really hadn't eaten much of her cooking. Ha ha ha, Royal Princess Duanja suddenly burst out into laughter, even holding onto her stomach. Chu Lian tapped the jade bowl in front of her. Princess, are you going to eat or not? If you're not going to eat this, I'll let the maidservants clear it away. Royal Princess Duanja quickly covered the bowl full of chicken porridge protectively and shook her head. No, don't clear it. I haven't even eaten enough. Chu Lu, I just suddenly thought that San Lang is rather pitiful, ha ha ha. He actually hasn't tasted such delicious buns before. Chu Lian glanced at Royal Princess Duanja helplessly. She was clearly reveling in someone else's misfortune. Who would laugh like that if they were pitying other circumstances? It wasn't until Royal Princess Duanja had filled up her tummy that she let the maidservants clear away the dishes on the table and ordered 2 cups of honey water. Royal Princess Duanja held up the white porcelain teacup with both hands. Chu Lu, the rankings for the autumn examinations are already out. Take a guess at who the top 3 are. Chu Lian stiffened. She hadn't expected the rankings to have come out so quickly. When she remembered that Xiao Bojian had been the top scholar for the autumn examinations in the story, her mood turned sour. She half-heartedly replied, "Scholars from the Imperial College." Royal Princess Duanja didn't notice Chu Lian's sudden change of mood. She nodded and continued, "That's right. Other than the second-place scholar, the first and third-place scholars all came from the Imperial College. The top scholar this time is the Imperial College's Xiao Bojian. Speaking of which, you should know of him. He's one of your grandfather's pupils and he's even been living in the Yin estate." Chu Lian completely missed whatever Royal Princess Duanja said after she heard that Xiao Bojian had gotten the first place in the examinations. Her heart seemed to quiver as she thought about the events in the later part of the book. As optimistic as she was, Chu Lian couldn't help but frown. Chu Lu. What's wrong? Are you listening to me? Chu Lian was dragged back to reality by Royal Princess Duanja. "Ah. What did you say, Your Highness?" Royal Princess Duanja cast a measuring gaze towards Chu Lian. "Chu Lu, what's happened to you? You seem a little absent-minded." "It's nothing. My spirit hasn't been too good these few days, perhaps due to how busy I've been." Royal Princess Duanja could tell that Chu Lian wasn't willing to talk about it, so she simply repeated the question she had just asked. "What kind of gift did you prepare for Countess Jingyan? When I arrived at Songtao Court just now, a few of your maidservants were chatting and saying that your eldest sister-in-law is going to give the Countess 100-year-old ginseng. San Lang isn't around, so you can't let her beat you. There's nothing to compare." "No way, I just don't like that eldest sister-in-law of yours. Look at how fragile and gentle she's acting. You must be getting bullied by her often here. This won't do. I'll send someone back to my estate to bring a 200-year-old red ginseng over." The corner of Xian's eyes twitched as she listened to this conversation and she sighed in her heart. With third young madam's temperament, how could she possibly get bullied? If anyone actually dared to bully her, she would return it eye for eye on the spot. There's no need for that. I've already prepared my gift. After saying so, Chu Lian sent Xian into her room to bring out an accessory case to let Royal Princess Duanja have a look. "This headdress is for Princess Wei. Your Highness, help me bring it back to her. I'll also be giving my mother a pearl headdress, just in a different style and with different materials. However, I personally designed both of these and ordered a master craftsman from Jinshi Pavilion to make them both." Royal Princess Duanja opened up the case, revealing an elegant pearl headdress within. Its design was novel and exquisite. Even the accessories from the palace couldn't compare to this. She said sourly, "Chu Lu, don't tell me that my mother has a higher position in your heart than I do." Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She could only bring out another small box. "Here, I prepared this for you. It's a pink pearl bracelet, also designed by me. I have a matching bracelet. It was only after seeing the bracelet that Royal Princess Duanjia's mood lifted. She immediately put it on her slender wrist and showed it off to Chu Lian. Actually, there wasn't any special meaning behind Chu Lian's gifts. She only felt that she had to give them something in return, especially since Princess Wei would bestow some rewards to her each time she visited Prince Wei's estate. Princess Wei was her elder too, so it wasn't good for her to keep receiving gifts from her without an appropriate return gift. It was already pretty late to be giving her a return gift at this time. Princess Wei treated her very well. She could even tell that Princess Wei looked at her with the same loving gaze she would look at Royal Princess Duanjia with. TL note, here comes more food porn for the crystal buns. After doing some research, it seems like the stuffing inside varies a lot by region. If someone knows more, feel free to correct me. A Chinese recipe on the Chinese Wikipedia says the stuffing is made with pig stomach fats, while a Teochew recipe says that the stuffing is made up of small diced yellow bean curd, long beans, and Chinese celery and some red peanuts. Crystal buns, rainbow crystal buns. I'm more familiar with these crystal dumplings. They're a type of dim sum also known as har gow, made of minced prawn paste. I had lots of these during my recent vacation in Hong Kong XD. Here's a recipe I found for them. https://redhousespice.com/hargao crystal prawn dumplings/crystal dumplings. Cute rabbit crystal dumplings. These are so cute, OMG. Chapter 262, Birthday Gift 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Although Chu Lian didn't know why Princess Wei cared for her so much, she knew that Princess Wei was being genuine. Chu Lian and Royal Princess Duanjia chatted happily together in Songtao Court. When Chu Lian noticed that it was about time, she led Royal Princess Duanjia over to Matriarchy's Qingxi Hall. The moment they reached Qingxi Hall's entrance, they could hear the pleasant buzz of women chattering away. Royal Princess Duanjia glanced curiously towards Qingxi Hall before tugging at Chu Lian's sleeve and asking, "It sounds like there are a lot of young ladies inside." A sly glint shone in Chu Lian's eyes. She covered the mischievous smile on her lips and replied, "Royal Princess, didn't you see my second brother today? I'm afraid grandmother's using this chance to help him look for a bride." "Ah." He Changjue was looking for a bride. For some reason, Royal Princess Duanjia's spirits fell upon hearing this piece of news. Chu Lian assumed Royal Princess Duanjia didn't know the context for this, so she continued to explain the current state of the Jingyan household. "Princess, I'm sure you don't know this, but my second brother doesn't come home often. Even grandmother can't do anything about him. However, as a legitimate son of House Jingyan, he can't stay single forever. So grandmother is using mother's birthday banquet as an excuse to invite more noble families over with their eligible daughters." He Changjue was already 24 this year. At this age, he could be considered an old bachelor in the capital. However, considering House Jingyan's good reputation and noble family status, coupled with He Changjue's looks, character, and position in the Dragon Guards, there were still many families looking to marry their daughters to him, even though he was slightly older than the usual age of a bachelor. Thus, there were quite a few noble madams and ladies in attendance today. The sweet and charming ladies here were all waiting for the chance to meet He Erlang later on when it was time to wish Countess Jingyan a happy birthday. Royal Princess Duanjia had actually heard some rumors about the He family's second son before. However, they had still been complete strangers at that time, so she had just treated them as some funny stories to listen to. Now that Chu Lian was talking about it to her directly, there was a strange feeling in her heart. Was He Erlang really going to choose a wife? Chu Lian pulled Royal Princess Duanjia along with her into the courtyard and headed towards the heated room. Chu Lian had gotten the chance to marry into House Jingyan thanks to that peculiar reputation the ladies of Housing had. Later on, she had made a name for herself at House Dingyuan. Almost right after that, the emperor had personally given her the title Honored Lady Genie, and then she had opened a restaurant that seemed to be growing more and more popular each day. Any one of these events would be enough to fuel the capital's gossip mills for a while. However, they were all centered around the same person and had happened one after another. The group of noble madams and ladies gathered around matriarchy were eagerly waiting to meet the honored Lady Genie, who had somehow gone from a nobody to the talk of the town right after marrying into House Jing'an. This lady had been an insignificant young lady from a third-rate noble house before. How had she suddenly turned into such a bright personage that no one was able to ignore? When Chu Lian and royal Princess Duanjia entered the heated room, everyone's gazes landed on the two of them at the same time. The two young ladies had very similar figures, the only differences were in their clothing and accessories. Their facial features even carried the same sense of purity and beauty. If not for the very different hairstyles and clothing the two were wearing, this group of ladies might not have been able to tell which one was royal Princess Duanjia and which one was House Jing'an's third young madam. When they had their first look at Chu Lian, who was wearing a dress with some auspicious patterns outlined in silver thread, the ladies were all slightly surprised. The actual appearance of Chu Lian was way too different from the image of the infamous honored Lady Genie they had in their minds. Chu Lian's young face still carried some baby fat in her cheeks. Her skin looked as soft as rose petals kissed with morning dew, and the rest of her features were equally fair and fine. There was the smallest smidge of pink lipstick accentuating her tender lips, and the corners of her mouth seemed to naturally curve upwards, so she looked like she was smiling even in the most neutral expression. The most startling feature of them all were her almond-shaped eyes. Slightly moist and crystal clear, they looked as if they could see through anything. Some of the older madams held a hand up to their foreheads in shock. They couldn't quite accept this huge gap between their expectations and reality. The honored Lady Genie, who was the talk of the town, was merely a young and tender little girl. After Chu Lian bobbed in greeting to the elders present, she tilted her head in extreme confusion. The corners of her eyes twitched as she had a strange feeling that the noble madams and misses seemed to be looking at her rather weirdly. Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't just any normal royal princess. With Chu Lian by her side, the attendees of today's banquet were naturally jumping for the chance to speak to either her or Chu Lian. Additionally, the food lovers present tried to come over to ask Chu Lian about reserving one of the special little courts in Gillen restaurant that only the rich could afford. They all hoped that they might use this chance to trade favors and get themselves one of those little courts. Regardless of gender, the latest trend amongst the capital's upper class was now to treat their friends to a meal at Gillen restaurant. That was something even more impressive than hosting a banquet at Yuehong restaurant. All the noble madams and ladies gathered around Chu Lian and royal Princess Duanjia. Even the focus of their chatter switched to these two outstanding young ladies, causing the expression of the originally popular Madame Zhou to turn a little stiff. However, matriarchy was happily watching. Prince Wei didn't participate in politics, and he was also the emperor's full-blooded brother. Now that royal Princess Duanjia was close with her third granddaughter-in-law, it also meant that Prince Wei's estate was close to House Jing'an. That was a very good thing indeed. Sanlang's wife might be somewhat lazy, but her actions always seemed to align with matriarchy's wishes. Thus, even though their guests were now surrounding the two young ladies, matriarchy didn't call a stop to it. Chapter 263, Birthday Gift, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Madame Zhou wanted to draw everyone's attention back, but she didn't dare to make any moves in front of matriarchy. She could only grit her teeth and bear with it. However, the gaze she cast towards Chu Lian was full of envy and disgust. This state of affairs didn't carry on for too long. When matriarchy saw that it was about time, she led the group of guests over to Countess Jing'an's courtyard. Once they entered the courtyard, they met heir Jing'an, He Changqi, and the second son, he Changjue. All of the guests here knew very well what the actual purpose of this gathering was. As soon as they entered the parlor, the focus of the noble madams and ladies shifted towards the two men. Royal Princess Duanjia was walking by Chu Lian's side. She turned her head slightly to look at He Erlang, only to see him standing there with his head lowered like a block of wood or a statue, not even daring to look up. It was only then that a hint of satisfaction showed in Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes. Countess Jing'an had already changed into an auspicious dark red gown and an outer coat lined with red fox fur. There was a turquoise headband resting on her forehead, and she had taken the care to powder up her face a little, concealing most of her usual sickly air. The thickness of her winter clothing also covered up how skinny she was. At a glance, she didn't look much different from a normal, healthy noble madam. The noble guests came up one by one to wish Countess Jing'an a happy birthday and to offer up their gifts. The guests today were all from houses familiar with House Jing'an. Knowing that the sickly Countess Jing'an wouldn't be able to withstand a prolonged banquet, they didn't drag out the ceremony and moved at a quick pace. Finally, it was time for the two daughters-in-law to congratulate their mother-in-law on her birthday. Madame Zhou's gift was indeed 100-year-old ginseng, causing the people gathered to react with amazement. Countess Jing'an held Madame Zhou's hands in hers and patted the back of her hand. Dalong's wife, you didn't have to go to such big expense. Mother, I would be willing to go vegetarian and pray in our family's Buddhist shrine for 3 months as long as it can help you recover, let alone give you just one ginseng. Countess Jing'an smiled and rebuked her gently for not caring more for her own health instead. The noble madams seated around Matriarch He and Countess Jing'an all praised Madame Zhou for being filial. Madame Zhou cast her gaze downwards as if embarrassed by the praise. In actual fact, she was brimming with glee. She had spent a few hundred taels on that 100-year-old ginseng and had even been feeling a little sorry about the expense. However, now that this ginseng had earned her some good reputation amongst these ladies, she felt that the money had been well spent. Filled with satisfaction, Madame Zhou's gaze couldn't help turning to Chu Lian. A glint of provocation and smugness from her victory shone in her eyes. Now that she had given such a precious gift right before Chu Lian, if Chu Lian's gift looked too shabby in comparison, she would completely lose face. She wanted to see how this smart third sister-in-law of hers was going to deal with this situation. Chu Lian was in the middle of whispering something to Royal Princess Duanjia, so she hadn't noticed her eldest sister-in-law's nasty look at all. Realizing that it was her turn, she turned around and took the box that Wenqing had been carrying for her before offering it up to Countess Jing'an. Mother, this headdress is my gift to you. I hope you like it. A headdress? Ha! How could a countess lack for any accessories at all? It looked like her third sister-in-law wasn't as smart as she imagined. Countess Jing'an's expression seemed normal. She received Chu Lian's gift cheerfully and affably. Sanlang's wife, you shouldn't have gone to all that trouble. Chu Lian was so young that she should have been able to stay in her maiden home for another 2 years, if not for Matriarchy's burning desire to have a great-grandson. Later on, after she had married in, Sanlang had treated her so abnormally. He hadn't been home much after getting married and had then taken off for the northern border without any warning. This little daughter-in-law of hers hadn't cried or complained. Instead, she had remained kind and innocent. There wasn't any resentment in her towards House Jing'an for Sanlang's actions, nor had she maintained a distance from the family. Countess Jing'an already felt guilty enough in her heart. Seeing how young Chu Lian was, she felt even more inclined to spoil Chu Lian. It's not the gift that matters, but the thought that counts. Chu Lian wasn't expecting to show off her gift. Just as she was about to turn and sit back down at her seat, Madame Zhou hurriedly shot a meaningful look at a young madam next to her. That young madam stepped forward and smiled as she said, I wonder what kind of headdress honored Lady Jeannie has presented as a gift. It can't possibly be something from the palace, could it? If Countess Jing'an doesn't mind, could you show it to us and let us expand our horizons? As expected, when it came to accessories, all the noble madams and ladies here were interested as well. Since someone had already started the topic, they all started to clamor, wanting to see what Chu Lian's gift was. Countess Jing'an hadn't been intending to open it on the spot. She also thought that her youngest daughter-in-law's gift would be rather average. While she was hesitating, Madame Zhou had already added oil to the fire after a quick turn of wit. "Mother, this is third sister-in-law's way of being filial to you. Why don't you just let everyone have a look?" Countess Jing'an didn't know how to get out of this situation without offending someone. She sent an apologetic look to Chu Lian before allowing her handmaid, Miaozhen, to open the accessory case. Royal Princess Duanjia looked down upon petty people like Madame Zhou the most. She rolled her eyes at Madame Zhou without the slightest bit of respect. When Madame Zhou turned her head, she just happened to catch Royal Princess Duanjia's eye roll. The anger that abruptly rose within her made her face turn all sorts of colors as she almost fainted right then and there in rage. Chapter 264, Taking a Concubine, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When the accessory case was opened, a sleek flash of light shone from within. All the spectating noble madams and ladies gasped in unison. A set of smooth, bright white pearl accessories was lying within the case, composed of a headdress, a necklace, a bracelet, a pair of earrings, and rings. The noble ladies gathered here had seen plenty of pearl accessories, but they had never seen such an elegant and eye-catching set before. The pearls weren't one of a kind, but the designs were enough to stun each and every one of the onlookers. The pearl necklace was the most impressive. On either side of the thin silver chain, there were white pearls interchanged with intricate little golden flowers, while two complicated-looking golden lotus flowers were entwined with each other and dangling from the center of the chain. Sitting in the center at the linking point of the lotus flower pattern was a smooth, silky golden pearl about the size of a thumbnail. Despite being surrounded by gold, the golden pearl didn't lose any bit of its own glow and instead looked even more lustrous, adding an aura of elegant luxury to the necklace. Actually, in this entire set of pearl accessories, this golden pearl was the main focus. It was also due to this golden pearl that the other normal pearls on the other accessories seemed even more white and ornate. The ladies were all stunned. They had never seen pearl accessories like these before. Even the accessories from the Imperial Palace couldn't match up to this. In a short moment, all the noble ladies were so entranced by the glowing pearls that they had forgotten to speak. Madame Zhou's pleased expression had instantly flipped the moment the accessory case had been opened. Though she had previously been able to keep her rage well hidden, this time, it was just too much. Irrespective of their ages, the ladies here lived luxurious lives, so they were naturally most interested in accessories and the like. While a rare 100-year-old ginseng might be able to make them gasp in surprise, a novel set of accessories would be able to make them go crazy. Countess Jing'an hadn't looked at the accessory case yet. When she noticed the expressions of the crowd surrounding her didn't look right, she turned to look at her side. Now it was her turn to be stunned. Countess Jing'an quickly came up with a light reprimand. Sanlang's wife. Dear child, how could you give me something so expensive? There weren't many women who didn't like dressing up in pretty clothes and jewelry. Everyone liked beautiful things. Even the sickly Countess Jing'an wasn't an exception. Countess Jing'an wouldn't have blamed Chu Lian if her gift had been ordinary. However, if her gift could make others envious, then of course she would be even more pleased with the gift. Now Countess Jing'an felt that the love and effort she had spent on her youngest daughter-in-law hadn't been wasted at all. Chu Lian was a good child who knew how to repay kindness. After getting praised by her mother-in-law in front of a crowd, Chu Lian didn't reply with some nice-sounding empty words to win even more of her favor like Madame Zhou had. She stood up and curtsied towards Countess Jingyan first before explaining with a smile, "Mother, please rest assured. This accessory set isn't as expensive as it looks. The pearls are all easily bought from Jinshi Pavilion. It's only the designs that were personally drawn by me. I had one of Jinshi Pavilion's master craftsmen make it for me." Chu Lian really hadn't spent much on it. For 2 sets of pearl accessories and a few bracelets, it hadn't even cost 500 taels. Not only that, Jinshi Pavilion's manager had even given her quite a few free gifts in addition. Jinshi Pavilion's manager wanted to keep the novel design she had given them and research it. After hearing Chu Lian's explanation, Countess Jingyan's heart melted. Her eyes were full of affection and helplessness. "You silly child. You're just too honest." The noble madams here weren't empty-headed. They knew that it was precisely because of the novel design that Jinshi Pavilion would have specially made these accessories at a low price, just for honored Lady Jeannie. They really wanted a set of those accessories for themselves. However, it would probably cost at least 1,000 taels at Jinshi Pavilion. The crowd became even more envious. One of the madams in the crowd even smiled and said, "Even so, it's even more rare that honored Lady Jeannie could personally draw some new designs for the Countess. Furthermore, pearls aren't like those precious jewels, or even gold or silver. As we know, pearls nurture the health. I hear that when worn over a long period of time, they might even have calming and beautifying effects." Countess Jingyan felt even more happier and touched after listening to this noble madam's words. The gaze she sent towards Chu Lian turned even warmer. The now completely ignored Madame Zhou gritted her teeth as the dissatisfaction in her heart grew even more. Her anger didn't fade after the gift-giving was over. Perhaps due to the grudge in her heart, she even made a few mistakes while preparing the seating arrangements for the banquet later, causing a few jokes at her expense. In the end, Matriarch He couldn't continue watching and sent senior servant Lu to help her. It was only then that the birthday banquet was completed successfully. When the guests had all departed and it was only their family left, the main branch was ordered to stay behind by Matriarch He and Countess Jingyan, right in front of the rest of the family. Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court with her servants. On the way back, Fu Yan couldn't resist complaining next to Chu Lian's side. "Third young madam, eldest young madam went overboard today. Do you think the matriarch kept eldest young madam behind to give her a scolding?" Chu Lian turned back to look at Fu Yan. "What grandmother wants to say to eldest sister-in-law has nothing to do with our third branch. We just have to keep our own consciences clear in our actions." Her expression was indifferent. It was clear that she wasn't happy with Fu Yan for gossiping. Fu Yan also knew that third young madam was angry, so she immediately lowered her head and kept silent. It didn't matter if Fu Yan gossiped about these matters within the confines of Songtao Court. However, if this were to spread out of their courtyard, then others would be able to reprimand her for not managing her servants properly. Furthermore, careless talk invites disaster. Being talkative wasn't necessarily a good thing, especially when it was one of her personal handmaids. Actually, she had already guessed why Matriarch He and Countess Jingyan had kept the main branch behind just now. This was something that was supposed to have happened earlier. It was only because she had interfered with Madame Zhou's fate and saved her from that kitchen fire that this matter had been delayed. She had thought that this event wouldn't happen now that Madame Zhou was hale and hearty. However, who could have known that some things would still run their course? Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, the trouble broiling in the main branch hadn't suddenly come into existence with her arrival. Chu Lian sighed. Now that things had progressed to this stage, it was already out of her hands. Chapter 265, Taking a Concubine, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. At this time, He Daolong had just walked out of Countess Jingyan's courtyard. However, it wasn't just him and his wife now. a young lady was following behind them with her head lowered and a blush on her cheeks. This lady was Countess Jingin's handmaid, Miaozhen. Miaozhen was no longer Countess Jingin's handmaid, and was now Dalong's bed servant, essentially, a concubine. This was something that matriarch He had personally decided. The matriarch had even ordered He Dalong to consummate their relationship this very night. He Changqi had a cold expression on his face now. His looks had taken after Count Jingin, a square face and a tall, strong body with tanned skin. When he put on such an expression, it was hard for others to get close to him. Right behind He Changqi was the pale Madame Zhou. Halfway back to their courtyard, she wanted to tug at her husband's sleeve. However, even though she reached out a few times, she couldn't bear to lower her dignity to do it in the end. By the time they reached home, the couple still hadn't exchanged a single word. Matriarch He's senior servant Lu was following behind the couple. She observed the couple indifferently before shifting her gaze away, remaining silent as well. When they reached the parlor, instead of trying to plead with He Changqi, she simply continued standing there with a ghastly pale face. This action made He Changqi press his lips together in empty disappointment. Even senior servant Lu, who was not far behind, shook her head secretly. Madame Zhou was just too much of a failure as a wife. When the steadfast loyalty of her relationship with her husband was being tested, she was still unwilling to lower her head and only tried to keep up a strong and haughty pretense. What sort of result could that action get her? Senior servant Lu hadn't spoken at all on the way here in order to give Dalong and his wife a chance. This was also something that matriarch He had instructed her to do in secret. Unfortunately, Madame Zhou hadn't been able to grasp this chance. In the parlor of their courtyard, husband and wife kept silent and waged a cold war with each other. He Changqi was originally a more traditional kind of person. How could he lower himself to coax his wife? Thus, the Cold War brewed even fiercer. Finally, senior servant Lu had to step up to break this stalemate. Eldest young madam, it's getting late. You've been busy the whole day, so why don't you rest a little earlier? This old servant will help arrange matters for Heir Jingin. Although senior servant Lu spoke politely, it was clear in her tone that she wasn't going to accept any refusal. Frustration had been brewing in Madame Zhou's belly for a long time. Senior servant Lu's words were like the spark to light the fuse. While in front of her mother-in-law, Countess Jingin, she had to control herself and suppress her emotions, but now that it was just an old servant in front of her, she could no longer continue holding herself back. Madame Zhou abruptly stood up and pushed senior servant Lu with a burst of strength that had come out of nowhere. You old servant! What are you? When has it been up to you to dictate matters in our branch? How could senior servant Lu have expected the normally dignified Madame Zhou to have lost her temper? What's more, she was acting like an immoral and unreasonable shrew. After getting pushed by Madame Zhou, senior servant Lu lost her balance and fell right onto the floor on her behind. Senior servant Lu was no longer young. How could her body bear such a fall? She cried out in pain, unable to get up. It was only when Madame Zhou noticed the extremely pained expression on the servant's face that she realized what she had done. She froze on the spot, not knowing what to do. He Changqi's eyes widened in shock. By the time he could finally react, he was about to try catching senior servant Lu, but she had already fallen to the ground. He strode over quickly and asked, Momo, are you all right? He Changqi had already been angry with Madame Zhou. Now that he had watched her personally push down his grandmother's trusted old servant, he was beside himself with rage. He glared fiercely at Madame Zhou and shouted, Madame Zhou! Look at what you've done. Calling you a shrew would be letting you off lightly. Madame Zhou had already been frightened by this turn of events. Now that her husband was shouting at her, she immediately switched gears. He Changqi, who are you calling a shrew? I'm talking about you. Good, very good. He Changqi, you traitor. You bastard! How dare you scold me like that? How could Madame Zhou bear with such insult? Furthermore, this was someone she had walked hand in hand with for close to 10 years. Her rage turned her face white, her chest heaved as she swept everything off the nearby table. Clatter, crash, went the porcelain teapots and cups as they met with the floor. That wasn't enough to quell her rage, so she picked up a cup that had been spared from the carnage and threw it at Heartwarming. Heartwarming stood there without dodging it, glaring at her with an icy expression. Thus, the cup smashed against the corner of Heartwarming's forehead. In the next second, crimson blood dripped down from the cut, dyeing half of his face red. TL note: in ancient China, there were different levels of concubines. The normal concubine is usually seen as half-wife and half-servant and may even take up the role of lady in charge of the household if there is no wife present. Meanwhile, men can take maidservants, sometimes their wives' very own handmaids, into their harem as bed servants, who were usually seen as just servants. Bed servants might even be able to rise to the rank of a normal concubine if they gave birth to sons. Children born from these concubines or bed servants were all seen as illegitimate, and only children born from lawfully wedded wives were seen as legitimate. There is also another rule, which can be broken, that men cannot take concubines until they have a legitimate wife, or they might be seen as crooked and not very ideal as husbands. The exception to this is taking a bed servant, usually a handmaid bestowed by their mothers, who is meant to educate them on knightly duties. Hopefully this helps to explain some of the inner tensions and reactions of the noble families, as well as why Matriarch He and Countess Jingyan seem so blasé about giving He Daolong a bed servant. A bed servant would hardly take the place of Madame Zhou and might even help with giving birth to a son for Daolong, so there's no threat to Madame Zhou. As a virtuous wife, she is also expected to accept her husband's expanding harem. Chapter 266, Found Him, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. One of the more quick-witted maidservants quietly retreated upon seeing this turn of events and rushed off to report to the matriarch. Not too far off, the waiting Miaozhen had suffered a fright. Eldest young madam had actually hit the air. By the time she regained her senses, she quickly ran over to Heartwarming's side and pulled out a handkerchief to cover the wound on his forehead. Her voice was choked up with anxiety as she said, Jingyan, you've been hurt. Quick, we have to call the imperial physicians. Madame Zhou froze upon seeing the blood on Heartwarming's face, her wits completely gone. However, upon seeing that slut Miaozhen still trying to spoil the relationship between her and her husband at a time like this, her quelled rage reignited once again. She lost all semblance of rationality as her eyes reddened due to her anger and fury within. You little bitch! How dare you speak in front of me? Right after Madame Zhou shouted, she bent down and picked up one of the porcelain shards on the ground, intending to throw it at Miaozhen. Having seen what had happened to Heartwarming, Madame Zhou's maidservants reacted much faster this time and quickly ran up to stop her. Madame Zhou's trusted senior servant cried out, My eldest young madam, please stop acting so rashly. Heartwarming stared Madame Zhou straight in the eyes with a cold glare as icy as the tundra. He reached out and pulled Miaozhen behind him, shielding her. His tone was colder than ever as he told his wife, Madame Zhou. I want to see how far you're going to take this madness today. After the maidservants took the porcelain shard from Madame Zhou's hands, she looked up only to see her normally loving husband staring at her with cold eyes. When she saw that Heartwarming was actually protecting another woman behind him, the final string in her mind snapped. She screamed shrilly like a mad harpy and charged towards Heartwarming recklessly, already beyond caring. Heartwarming ignored the fresh blood flowing down from his forehead and continued watching Madame Zhou descend into madness with half of his stony face covered in blood. He couldn't get his mind around how his warm and caring wife had suddenly turned into this person he didn't recognize at all. For so many years, he could swear on his conscience that he hadn't mistreated Madame Zhou in any manner. The He family's rules were strict and he hadn't taken any concubines. Furthermore, he hadn't fooled around with other women outside the estate either. Even when out with his friends, he always drew the line. Although he and Madame Zhou still hadn't been able to get a son, they had everything else together. He had never pushed Madame Zhou on the matter of carrying on the next generation. He had also secretly considered what to do if he never had any sons in his life. Since he still had 2 brothers down the line, it wasn't necessarily just up to him to carry on the family line. As long as he and his wife remained harmonious, grandmother wouldn't say anything more. However, before he had been able to tell all this to Madame Zhou, she had somehow changed. He Dalong's heart instantly turned as desolate as the wild plains of Liangzhou. The image of his brilliant and virtuous wife seemed to have abruptly shattered and vanished into nothing. Madame Zhou put up a wild struggle against the people holding her back. Upon managing to break free, she pushed the maidservants aside and charged towards He Changqi with a deranged look on her face, shouting, "You little slut! How dare you seduce the heir? I'll teach you a lesson right now." However, before Madame Zhou could even touch the corner of Miaozhen's dress, a clear smack echoed throughout the room. Madame Zhou felt an intense pain in her cheek. In the next second, her body fell to the ground against her will. When Chu Lian helped matriarchy in, it was just in time to see He Dalong slap Madame Zhou on the face without any bit of mercy. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes widened in absolute shock. In the next moment, she caught sight of He Changqi's half-bloody face and suffered another shock once again. What was going on? How had things gotten to this state in less than an hour? Madame Zhou had also been stunned by He Changqi's merciless slap. She was sprawled on the ground, one hand held up to her swollen left cheek, while she looked up in disbelief at He Changqi. As if her heart was about to break, she cried, "He Changqi! You actually hit me!" By this time, matriarchy's sharp old eyes were lit up with rage, especially after she spotted senior servant Lu still paralyzed and lying on the ground. She paused where she stood, only to tighten her grip around her vermilion bird head cane and slam the end of it down onto the marble tiles with a clear thunk. "All of you, stop right now. Are you trying to start a rebellion here?" Matriarchy's tone was full of dignity. Right after she spoke, the family guards that the main steward had sent from the outer court separated Madame Zhou and He Changqi. On the other side, some maidservants carried the injured senior servant Lu off to a side room. There were also servants who immediately started tidying up the mess in the parlor. Perhaps matriarchy's angry shout had come to some use, as Madame Zhou finally regained some of her rationality. Her eyes were fixed on that slut Miaozhen as she helped He Changqi to a chair and then helped the doctor with cleaning up the wound on his forehead. The corner of Madame Zhou's lips tugged downwards, but in the end, she wasn't able to say a word. Now that the situation was under control, Chu Lian helped matriarchy to the main seat in the parlor. Once the matriarch was seated with her hands on her cane, she shouted once again with a stony expression, "All of you in the main branch. Kneel down right now." Chu Lian glanced at the enraged matriarchy next to her before secretly glancing at her brother-in-law and sister-in-law in front of her, about to kneel down with the support of the servants around them. She quickly whispered into matriarchy's ear. Following that, Chu Lian led the servants she had brought with her out of the parlor to check on senior servant Lu, who was being treated by a doctor in one of the side rooms. Matriarchy was about to reprimand the main branch. As the most junior family member present, she would have only earned her brother-in-law and sister-in-law's ire if she were to witness such a humiliating scene. Chapter 267, Found Him, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian watched over senior servant Lu in the side room while waiting for movement from the parlor. Luckily, senior servant Lu's body was still rather robust, so she had only broken a bone from this fall. She would be completely fine after lying in bed and resting for 3 to 4 months. It was only about an hour later that someone came over from the parlor to report. When Chu Lian finished listening to the report, she quickly got up to return to the parlor. As she held on to Matriarchy's arm to support her as they left the main branch's courtyard, Chu Lian turned back to look through the parlor's open doors. The master and mistress of the main branch were still kneeling in the center of the parlor, their backs ramrod straight. However, husband and wife were now like strangers, ignoring each other. After sending Matriarchy back to Qingxi Hall, it was clear that the matriarch was worn out. Before she left, the matriarch didn't forget to remind her not to speak of the matter, and especially not to let Countess Jingyan find out. Chu Lian nodded in agreement. She sent the matriarch all the way to her bedroom before returning to Songtao Court. The next day, Madame Zhou had been grounded by Matriarchy. She heard that He Changqi had already consummated his relationship with Miaozhen last night and that Miaozhen had settled into He Changqi's study. Due to various reasons and circumstances, He Daolong had still taken a concubine before he had hit 30 years of age. However, when the servants talked about it in private, they would say that the heir had merely accepted a bed servant. A bed servant couldn't be counted as a concubine, so he hadn't broken the He family's rules. After all, it was his wife who hadn't been able to give birth to a male heir after 10 years. Since Madame Zhou had been grounded by Matriarchy for half a month, the management of the estate fell to Matriarchy instead. In the past few days, whenever Chu Lian made her morning visits to Qingxi Hall, she would be held back by the matriarch for quite some time, either getting forced to go over some of the estate's account books or to watch the matriarch handle various matters of the estate. If not for Chu Lian being a bag of lazy bones who didn't want to take over the management of the estate, Matriarchy would have probably let her temporarily replace Madame Zhou as the lady in charge. In the blink of an eye, it was already mid-October. These days, Chu Lian didn't leave the estate at all in order to avoid the inescapable pest, Xiao Bojian. During this time, Royal Princess Duanjia only visited her once to pass on some gifts from Princess Wei. Before she left, Chu Lian accompanied Royal Princess Duanjia on a walk around her own courtyard. They had even gone to the study in the outer court, but Royal Princess Duanjia's expression still remained unhappy for some reason. Chu Lian had too many things on her plate, so she didn't delve deeper into the matter. She and Royal Princess Duanjia also discussed opening a jewelry store together. This time, with Prince Wei's estate taking the lead, she wouldn't have to worry about much. Everything would be left up to Princess Wei's people to arrange. All she had to do was contribute her part to it, designing some new accessories every month. Currently, Chu Lian was lying on the wooden lounge chair by the window in her room. She had a book in one hand, but she had been stuck on the same page for quite a while. If they went by the novel's original plot, then the final imperial examination would be held in the upcoming days. Xiao Bojian's name would most likely spread throughout the whole capital by then, because he would become the top scholar of the year. It would also signify the start of the war. The Tuhans were going to gather up an army to invade Liangzhou after years of peace in the north. The novel had simply given this event a small mention in the story. Chu Lian didn't know what the exact details were like. She only knew that it was a hard-won war and that there had been many casualties in the northern border troops. Now that her crazy husband He Sanlang was there in the north, was he going to be safe? Chu Lian sighed. Even though her aim had always been to be a happy layabout, she didn't know why she was actually feeling a little worried. While Chu Lian's thoughts were a mess, Xian's joyful voice rang out from the outer room. "Third young madam, some news came from Gillen Restaurant." Chu Lian set down the book in her hands and turned to look. Xian was usually very calm and steady. Why was she suddenly getting so excited? Had something good happened? When she heard Xian mention Gillen Restaurant, a single thought appeared in Chu Lian's mind. Had they found that person? Without waiting for Xian to come over to her, Chu Lian pushed herself up using the armrests and cried out in surprise, "Have they found the person who can answer all three questions?" Xian was smiling so widely that her eyes had turned to crescents. "Indeed they have, third young madam." Right after they found him, Manager Qin sent someone over to the estate to report it. He said that that person's currently eating in one of Gillen Restaurant's private rooms together with an elderly man. Chu Lian hurriedly got up, not even caring that one of the embroidered shoes on her feet had dropped off. She ran to her closet with one foot clad in only silken socks. "Quick, help me change. Tell Wenlan to prepare the carriage in the outer court first. I have to go to Gillen Restaurant right now." "Oh, right, get senior servant Zhong to bring out one of the jars of grape wine I brewed recently. And don't forget to send someone to notify grandmother that I'm going out." Chu Lian was completely flustered. That person was Great Dr. Miao. She had actually found him. Chapter 268, The Great Doctor Shows His Skill. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When Chu Lian finally reached Gillen Restaurant, Manager Qin personally guided her to a private room where the person she was looking for was waiting. The moment Chu Lian entered the room, she could hear people talking behind the screen placed in front of the entrance. "Brother Miao, if not for you, we would have had to wait a whole month to eat in this Gillen Restaurant." "Oh. This Gillen Restaurant is that popular?" "Brother Miao, you've just arrived here so you wouldn't know about this, but the owner of this Gillen Restaurant is the very, very wise." Immediately after, a deep chuckle resounded. "As smart as this owner is, how could they compare to Brother Wang?" Gillen Restaurant's Mr. Wang burst out into laughter. "I can't live up to that boast. Honored Lady Jeannie and I can't be compared on the same level. Her business skill is so much better than mine. Can you guess how long it took for Gillen Restaurant to become this popular in the capital? A month, maybe 2. Surely you're not going to tell me that it only took 10 days. Old Wang, even if you like to exaggerate your stories, that's just too unbelievable. There's always a certain order to things. When you brought me here, it was obvious to me that this old alleyway isn't a good location for a restaurant." Mr. Wang shook his head and grinned. He lifted one finger for the man sitting across from him, happy that he had finally found something that could shock his old friend. I'm going to tell you. Brother Miao, it only took a single day for this restaurant to become known across the entire capital. Great Dr. Miao was in the middle of picking up some pork slices in mashed garlic. When he heard his old friend's words, his eyes almost popped out of his head. "Brother Wang, you're not pulling my leg, are you?" Mr. Wang cast a sideways look at his old friend with sharp eyes. If you don't believe me, you can ask honored Lady Jeannie herself when she comes. You're saying that the owner of this restaurant will be coming to look for us." Mr. Wang really didn't know what to do with this innocent, naive old friend of his. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Since his old friend was the only one who could answer Gillen Restaurant's 3 questions, what did that mean? Those questions had been specially prepared for Great Dr. Miao. They had been put up just to lure this big fish into their net. Someone had likely reported this news to honored Lady Jeannie. In a short moment, he would finally be able to meet the owner of this Gillen Restaurant. Chu Lian took in a deep breath to suppress the excitement in her heart and made sure she had a normal expression in place before stepping around the screen. Once she passed the screen, she could see 2 men sitting across from each other as they ate and drank. Chu Lian bobbed in greeting towards the 2 men before taking a seat at the same table facing the window. Manager Qin personally guarded the private room from outside. An hour later, Chu Lian brought her maidservants out with her as she exited the room. Manager Chin fell into step behind her and carefully asked, "Third young madam, was it successful?" Chu Lian had lost control of her emotions. Her good cheer was written all over her face. To Manager Chin, she nodded and instructed, "Let Mr. Miao stay in Dark Court 1 over the next few days. In 7 days, pick someone you trust and bring Mr. Miao to the Jing'an estate." After she finished giving Manager Chin his orders, she returned to the Jing'an estate. The novel was right. Great Dr. Miao was an absolute foodie. With those questions as bait, and after offering up the grape wine she had personally brewed, Great Dr. Miao had come to an agreement with her and agreed to go to the Jing'an estate in 7 days to check Countess Jing'an's illness. However, one of the conditions was that Chu Lian had to personally cook a dish he hadn't tried at Gillan restaurant. This condition was an easy one for Chu Lian, so she agreed to it without hesitation. On the way back to the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian had already thought of what to make, the crispy roast duck that Royal Princess Duanjia kept talking about. House Jing'an's carriage was driving down a spacious green cobblestone street when a black horse galloping at full speed approached the carriage from the front. At a glance, it could be seen that the black horse wasn't just any common steed off the street. The manservant driving the carriage was worried that they might get into an accident, so he nudged the carriage horses to the side of the road while cutting their speed drastically, doing his best to give the galloping horse as much space as he could. However, the rider of that galloping horse didn't seem to notice that gesture at all. Conversely, he stuck to his own path and even moved closer to the carriage. Without waiting for House Jing'an's manservant to react, the black horse crossed paths with Chu Lian's carriage with just a hair's breadth between them, and then disappeared at the end of the street. As the horse sprinted past, the gust of wind it left in its wake parted the curtains covering the window of Chu Lian's carriage. Chu Lian could only hear the thundering hoofbeats pass by a little too close for comfort. She was about to ask the guards outside what was happening when she saw that a thin bamboo tube had been thrown into the carriage. It had rolled onto the carpet right in front of her. Any words she had to say were stuck in the back of her throat as her gaze slowly shifted to the thin bamboo tube. The special pattern on it was all too familiar to her. It was the exact same pattern as the one on the capsule she had found in the orange at the Jing estate when she had requested for fresh oranges. The capsule back then, however, had been slightly more fine. Xian was sitting with her inside the carriage. When she saw the bamboo tube as well, she suffered a huge fright. Her head was also lowered as she stared at that little bamboo tube on the carpeted floor of the carriage. Fear filled her heart. If it hadn't been a simple bamboo tube, but instead some hidden weapon, then her master would probably be injured right now. Xian was about to speak up to ask a question when Chu Lian tugged at her sleeve and shook her head, her eyebrows furrowed. Xian then quickly covered her own mouth and nodded a few times at Chu Lian, indicating that she wasn't going to say anything. By this time, one of the guards escorting the carriage from outside had come over to the window. He asked in a worried tone, "Third young madam, are you all right?" Chu Lian quickly tried to regain her composure and make her voice sound normal before answering, "Yes, I'm fine." "Why? Has something happened outside?" Hearing her calm tone, the guard relaxed. "It's nothing, it was just a galloping horse passing by." "Third young madam, if you need anything, please call for this subordinate." After waiting for a moment and ensuring that there were no other sounds outside the carriage, Chu Lian reached out to pick up the bamboo tube. With the tube in her hands, she waited yet another moment before taking in a deep breath and opening it up. TL note, the pork slices in mashed garlic look so good. I can almost taste the yummy garlic. I found a recipe in English if anyone's interested in trying it out, https://www. Chinasichuanfood.com/pork slice in mashed garlic/ Also, someone asked for a glossary of all the foods that have appeared in TMR so far. Would anyone be willing to help collate them? I can link to it in the table of contents if you do. 3 pork slices in minced garlic alternate version with chili sauce. Chapter 269. The Great Doctor shows his skill. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. There was a rolled-up piece of paper inside the bamboo tube. She gently smoothed out the paper and read the 2 lines of words written in the Shojin style. Xiao Bojian's writing was completely different from He Changdi's. He Changdi's words were usually written in bold and powerful strokes, lending a somewhat grand air to them. Xiao Bojian wrote with such force that his words could be seen from the back of the paper, but they were neat and almost mechanical. It was rare to see any words touching. You could tell what a person was like through their handwriting. However, just looking at this meticulous handwriting, it was likely that no one would be able to discern the well-hidden greed and ambition within Xiao Bojian. Anything could be faked. What the naked eye could see, what was shown on people's faces, all of it could be used to deceive others. Xian's eyes were fixed on her master. When she saw that Chu Lian's brows were drawn together and her expression didn't seem too good, she tried asking, "Third young madam, is anything the matter?" Chu Lian returned to reality and directly passed the note over to Xian without any intention of concealing its contents. Xian took the note and glanced over it. There wasn't much to read, but the gist of the message was that they were requesting to meet with her master half a month later. Xiao Bojian had successfully become the top scholar in the final imperial examination, and old Duke Ying had been his mentor. He would hold a banquet of gratitude for his mentor in the Ying estate then. Xiao Bojian was hinting that Chu Lian should use this chance to return to her maiden house. Xian looked at Chu Lian worriedly and bit her lip in unease. "Third young madam, do you want to go?" Chu Lian returned Xian's stare for a long while before asking, "Xian, do you think that I'll be going?" Xian cast her gaze downwards, not daring to look at Chu Lian. Quite some time passed before she finally managed to squeeze out the words, "Mr. Zhao's status is no longer as ordinary as before." Chu Lian sneered. No longer ordinary. He was just a measly top scholar. Even if he had a mysterious organization in his hands, so what? She, Chu Lian, wasn't one to follow someone else's bidding. Chu Lian took the paper note from Xian's hands and tore it to shreds before throwing it into her hand warmer and turning it into ashes. The specially carved bamboo tube was also thrown out of the carriage. Xian's eyes widened as she watched Chu Lian's actions. "Third young madam, you're not going. Even if he becomes a first-ranked official, that has nothing to do with me. I'm the third young madam of House Jing'an now, and I'm no longer that helpless, powerless sixth miss of House Ying. There were plenty of people willing to protect her now." Xian was struck into a daze. When she finally recovered, she smiled sweetly despite the tears in her eyes. Chu Lian was helpless before this silly handmaid of hers. "What are you crying for, you little?" Xian quickly wiped at her eyes with her handkerchief, her smile still shining brightly underneath her tear-stained cheeks. "Third young madam, this servant isn't crying, this servant is happy." She was really happy. Compared to the past 6th Miss Chu, she liked the current third young madam of House Jing'an more. It was great that third young madam could think so clearly. When the carriage reached the Jing'an estate, master and servant both treated that bamboo tube as if it had never existed. Chu Lian continued passing her days lazily. She didn't think that Xiao Bojian would send someone to kidnap her if she didn't go to the Ying estate. Xiao Bojian wasn't that bold yet. 7 days later, Great Dr. Miao was personally escorted to the Jing'an estate by manager Qin. Chu Lian had also notified matriarchy of this visit beforehand. Today, Chu Lian had invited Royal Princess Duanjia over. Since this matter involved Countess Jing'an's health, He Erlang had also rushed back to the estate despite his busy schedule. The dragon guards had been given a mission and He Changjue was to be posted to the neighboring city of Zhangzhou the day after tomorrow. He was also taking this chance to return to the estate and bid his farewells to his family. 3 days later, he would be departing the estate to meet his commanding officer at the west gate of the capital and set off for Zhangzhou. Chu Lian personally made roast duck for the foodie Great Dr. Miao. When Great Dr. Miao came out from Countess Jingyin's bedroom, even the normally calm Chu Lian was so anxious that she quickly stood up to welcome him. "Mr. Miao, how is mother's illness? Can it be treated?" Great Dr. Miao nodded confidently. "Honored lady, please rest assured. Madam's condition isn't that severe, and I can cure it once and for all. However, there's something I have to tell honored lady beforehand." Matriarch was seated at the head of the room. When she heard those words, it was as if a burden that she had carried for years had suddenly lifted. Her expression seemed relaxed as she said, "Mr. Miao, please feel free to speak. We'll do anything as long as it's something within our ability." Great Dr. Miao stroked his beard as he said, "Well, this matter could be easy or difficult, depending on the circumstances." Chu Lian earnestly listened, not willing to miss a single word he said. TL note, Shoujin-style calligraphy is literally thin golden style and is appropriately named XD Shoujin style, from Wikipedia. Chapter 270, War at the Northern Border, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. If you want to cure Madam's illness once and for all, you need a single medicinal ingredient. However, this ingredient only grows in the high mountains of the extreme north. The medicinal ingredient that Great Dr. Miao needed was a type of alpine flower. It was also one of the rarest alpine flowers and was called snow mountain mists. It grew only on the peaks of snow-capped mountains and would only bloom at the coldest times of the year. After blooming, it would wither away in just 2 to 3 days. To be able to use it in medicine, the flower had to be picked right before it withered, otherwise it would lose all its worth as a medicinal ingredient. It was known to grow in the border between the Great Wu Dynasty and the Tuhun's territory Mount Aoming. In another 3 months, it would be time for the snow mountain mists on Mount Aoming to bloom. This rare ingredient was hard to preserve and there weren't many fields that required the use of it. Most doctors didn't even know of the medicinal uses of this flower, so it was impossible to find it on the market. Even Great Dr. Miao had only incidentally found out about its uses during his younger days when he had wandered all over the land. Great Dr. Miao spoke bluntly to the various members of the He family gathered in the parlor. The treatment for Countess Jingyin's body couldn't be delayed for too long. Even if he personally helped stabilize her condition, she could only go on like that for another 2 years. If they couldn't find this snow mountain mist's flower within 2 years, then there would be nothing he could do. After Great Dr. Miao finished explaining the situation, he left the parlor to write a prescription for Countess Jingyin. Only Matriarch He, the eldest son He Changqi, the second son He Changjue, and the newlywed wife of the third son, Chu Lian, were left in the parlor. The joy that had been present on their faces earlier had disappeared. The matriarch's expression was so serious that the wrinkles on her face creased further. When Chu Lian noticed this, her heart ached for the matriarch. She tried to reassure the old lady by saying, "Grandmother, at least there's some hope for mother now. And it's not as if this type of flower is completely unheard of. Having some hope is better than having none at all, isn't it?" Matriarch He took in a deep breath and patted Chu Lian's hand. "You're right, Lianer. At least there's some hope for your mother's illness now. I should be happy instead." Silence reigned in the parlor for a while more before He Erlang abruptly stepped forward and knelt before Matriarch He. In a firm voice, he said, "Grandmother, let me go to the north to search for this flower for mother." Right after He Erlang spoke, He Daolang also knelt down in front of Matriarch He. "Grandmother, don't let Erlang go. Erlang hasn't even gotten married yet. I'm the eldest son of this family. When father left to protect the border, he instructed me to take care of grandmother, mother, and my 2 younger brothers. It's obviously me who should go on this trip to the north. No, eldest brother, I'll go. Second brother, are you going to disobey your older brother? Let me go. The normally harmonious brothers were actually fighting to be the one to go to the northern border. Matriarchy was starting to get a headache from their quarreling. She slapped the table next to her with a loud bang and said, "Enough. What are you fighting for?" It was only then that the 2 brothers stopped and quieted down. However, none of them stood up and they simply waited for Matriarchy's final verdict. Matriarchy massaged her forehead. After a short pause, she heaved a sigh and said, "This old woman knows that you're all filial children. However, Dalong, you hold a position at court. Without the Emperor's permission, you can't abandon your post without a proper reason. Our estate needs you here as well. We can't do without a male master here to hold the fort in such a big estate. And Erlang has just gotten a mission in Zhangzhou. I heard this mission was ordered by the Emperor himself. You can't disobey imperial orders. If you go to the northern border at this time, are you going to willingly deceive the Emperor? So neither of you are allowed to go." What? Neither of them were allowed to go. But they were the only male members of House Jing'an left in the capital. If neither of them were to go, how could they stop worrying? It was their very own mother who was severely ill. "Grandmother, you can't. If we don't go, what's going to happen to mother?" He Dalong and he Erlang asked in unison. Matriarchy opened her mouth to speak. She had a troubled expression on her face. Count Jing'an was deeply in love with his wife. If he were to find out about this piece of good news, he would never let the chance go. She also felt very guilty towards this daughter-in-law of hers, and wished for her speedy recovery. Chu Lian pressed her lips before reminding all of them, "Grandmother, have you all forgotten about husband? Why don't you ask husband to send someone to Mount Aoming to investigate? With husband around, he'll surely get the job done." Matriarchy froze for an instant. She looked at Chu Lian before turning to the 2 grandsons kneeling before her. She felt that Chu Lian had brought up a good suggestion. After thinking it over, she declared, "Even if you want to go to the northern border, you won't be able to set out in just 1 or 2 days. There are too many things to prepare for in the estate. I have to think about it carefully. Lianer is right, we still have Sanlang at the northern border, so the 2 of you shouldn't worry too much. Especially you, Erlang. You can't fool around with an imperial mission on your shoulders. Pack up and go back to the left military guards today." He Chungjue wanted to protest, but after getting glared at by He Dalong, he could only lower his head and agree to it. Chu Lian escorted Matriarchy back to Qingxi Hall before returning to her own courtyard. TL note, yes, our adorable author, Snow Mountain Mists did a self-insert, and added herself as a medicinal ingredient in the story XD. Chapter 271, War at the Northern Border, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Great Dr. Miao had been invited to stay longer in the Jing'an estate, and his daily meals were now the responsibility of the kitchen in Chu Lian's courtyard. Great Dr. Miao was an amiable guest as long as he had some delicious food before him, so he settled in rather peacefully. 3 days later, Hao Xing sent Matriarchy an invite for Xiao Bojian's thank you banquet for his mentor. They specially invited both the matriarch and honored Lady Genie. As Matriarchy held the invitation in her hands and wondered how she should reply, Chu Lian's father, Chu Qizheng, had also sent an invite over. It was delivered straight to Chu Lian. Chu Lian didn't know that Matriarchy had been invited as well. Her brows furrowed when she received the invitation from her father. Xiao Bojian seemed to have anticipated her reluctance to attend the banquet and had purposely gotten her father to send her an invite. What was he trying to do? Chu Lian's mood remained agitated until late afternoon, when she brought the invite to Qingxi Hall to discuss the matter with Matriarch He. Just as grandmother and granddaughter had settled down in the parlor of Qingxi Hall, they could hear some noise coming from outside. Matriarch He hadn't been in a good mood in the first place. When she heard the disturbance, her expression turned grave. Muxiang, go outside and find out what's going on. In a short moment, Muxiang returned. Her face was full of anxiety as she ran back in without minding her usual etiquette. She hurriedly reported, Matriarch, the person causing the disturbance outside is a guard from Prince Jin's estate. He said that there's something urgent to report to Matriarch. This servant accidentally overheard a part of it. War has broken out at the northern border. What? Matriarch He abruptly stood up in shock. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes had also widened in surprise. However, she had already been mentally prepared for this piece of news, so her reaction was much calmer than Matriarch He's. The news was too much for Matriarch He. Her body wavered before she completely lost her strength and almost fell forward. Luckily, Chu Lian spotted this in time and quickly caught hold of Matriarch He. The maidservants nearby also hurriedly stepped forward to support the matriarch. Grandmother. Are you all right? Are you feeling unwell anywhere? Matriarch He leaned on Chu Lian's shoulder as she massaged the bridge of her nose. After a long moment, she seemed to have finally recovered some of her spirit. She slowly opened her eyes. I'm all right now. Quick, let the messenger in. Muxiang rushed out to call the messenger. Chu Lian helped Matriarch He to her seat once again. Scared for the matriarch's health, she told Wenlan to request Great Dr. Miao's presence. The worn-looking man was escorted in by the main steward of the outer court. It was only after the messenger showed his token that Matriarch He finally believed that this man was from Prince Jin's estate. Tell me, what's happening at the northern border? Matriarch He's voice was hoarse and carried a heavy sense of fatigue. The messenger bowed before he started his report. The Tuhan army has gathered outside Liangzhou. The northern border troops have already skirmished with them a few times. Great General Qian is currently leading the northern border troops and doing his best to defend against the Tuhans. However, the weather is getting worse over there and Liangzhou city is seeing heavy snowfall. The only worry is that the heavy snow might close up the mountain pass and block the supply line. When two armies are at war, their biggest worry is running out of supplies. The Tuhans had bided their time for over a decade. It was likely that they had already sussed out the supply times of the northern border troops and had specially chosen this period to mount a surprise attack. Matriarch He and Chu Lian both gasped upon hearing this news. Once their supplies ran out, the whole army would likely starve to death before the Tuhans took action. This wasn't a warm spring day they were facing. The winter over there could even kill the hardy, frost-resistant yaks. Matriarch He felt her body turn to jelly. She turned an affectionate yet pitiful gaze upon the young granddaughter-in-law next to her. The words she wanted to say refused to come out of her throat. After a short moment, Matriarch He seemed to have rediscovered her voice. All right, I've received your report. You can go back now. If there's any news, please ask Prince Jin to inform us. The guard who had played messenger bowed once again before quickly departing. The atmosphere inside the parlor was heavy. It was only after a long period of time had passed that Matriarch He finally spoke up again. Lianer, it's been hard on you. Chu Lian paused for a moment in surprise before reaching out to grasp Matriarch He's wrinkled hand. She shook her head gently and said, Grandmother, please don't say that. When husband went off to the northern border, no one could have expected those Tuhans to start acting again after so many years of peace. As the saying goes, danger opens the door of opportunity. Maybe this Tuhan attack might be a good chance for husband. It's useless for us to keep worrying here in the estate. Why don't we invite eldest brother here to discuss this matter? Eldest brother has many connections, so he might be able to look for more news. Matriarch, he was getting old after all. Even though she was still wise, her mind wasn't as quick as it had been. Upon hearing Chu Lian's reminder, it was like a light went off in her head. She quickly ordered someone to summon He Daolang back to the estate. He Changqi's many connections did come to use. He quickly gathered some news using various channels. War had indeed broken out at the northern border. Furthermore, it was snowing heavily in Liangzhou city now. Although the court wanted to send in relief, they were held up by the snows at the foot of the Qin Mountains. The reinforcements and supplies weren't able to pass. The alternate path was to go through Chongzhou Prefecture and go down the Li River to reach Su City. Beyond Su City was Lake Qianshan. However, by this time, the lake had already frozen over and they couldn't sail across at all. With all the roads to the northern border closed, the officials at court were at a loss for what to do. They could only watch the situation get increasingly worse. Right at this time, the news of a major case of embezzlement in the neighboring city of Zhangzhou spread throughout the capital. As part of the Dragon Guards, He Erlang was assisting with the case, so he probably wouldn't be able to return for another month. Prince Jin sent news about Liangzhou every day. Meanwhile, Matriarch he was looking more and more frail as the days passed. Countess Jing'an, whose health had just taken a turn for the better, inadvertently overheard the servants talking about the war in Liangzhou and immediately fainted right over, becoming bedridden once more. This winter, the whole of House Jing'an seemed to be on the verge of collapse, as if it would just vanish to the whims of time on the next tick of a second. Chapter 272, Preparations, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. On the night that Chu Lian had found out that war had broken out in the northern border, she couldn't fall asleep until midnight, even though she usually liked to go to bed early and get her beauty sleep. Chu Lian tossed and turned on her bed. The drowsiness that had plagued her earlier had all but disappeared, and she couldn't summon it back no matter what she tried. In the end, Chu Lian could only lie flat on her back underneath her warm blankets, staring up at the canopy of her bed shrouded in darkness. Although she had read the original book, so many things had changed by now. And even if the events had somehow miraculously stayed the same, it wasn't like the book had described every single matter in great detail either. Take, for example, the battle going on at the northern border. Chu Lian only knew that an event like that would happen. She didn't know whether they were going to win or lose in the end, let alone how they might have won. Although she wanted to be a carefree layabout who just cooked good food and earned money all day, the prerequisite for this was that House Jing'an had to be doing well. If House Jing'an was in a precarious situation, then this title of third young madam would turn to nothing. Furthermore, she loved the family she had in the Jing'an estate very much, with the exception of Madame Zhou. She didn't want to see them sad or grieving, nor did she want to see them individually sacrifice themselves for the family. Chu Lian closed her eyes, on the brink of making a decision that would determine the fate of her family. When her almond-shaped eyes reopened, it was as if the entire universe was reflected in them, even in the midst of absolute darkness. All this time, she had been living happily under the protection of her senior family members. Now that it was time for her to carry her part of the family burdens, she wasn't going to shy away. After she had finished thinking things through, Chu Lian stopped tossing and turning. Her eyes slid shut and her breathing turned long and even in just a short moment. Xian was on night duty today and waiting in the side room just outside Chu Lian's bedroom. When she could no longer hear any noises from within, she settled down to rest for the night in relief. The next day, the lazybones Chu Lian actually managed to get up by herself without waiting for the maidservants to wake her. When senior servant Zhong entered the bedroom, she saw that Chu Lian had changed into a pink tunic suited for physical exercise, while her soft, dark hair had been tied up into a high ponytail that went all the way down to her waist. Senior servant Joan gaped. She had to calm herself down for some time before she finally found her voice again. Third young madam, why are you dressed like that? Chu Lian tidied up her hair a little, swung her arms and legs around and then pulled on some riding boots. It was only after all that she looked up and smiled at senior servant Joan. For morning practice, of course. Senior servant Joan's face flushed purplish red. Morning practice. She knew that the master and young masters of the estate had the habit of getting up early in the morning to practice martial arts, especially third young master, who would practice every day regardless of the weather outside. That was because House Jing'an was a military official family. If they wanted to get a post at court, they had to use their abilities to earn one. However, the young and sweet third young madam was just a 15-year-old girl who still had baby fat on her cheeks. Wasn't the idea she was going to morning practice quite laughable? Xian and the rest hadn't mentioned that third young madam practiced martial arts either. There was a special martial arts arena and indoor gym in Songtao Court. It was He Changdi who used those areas previously. Now it was Chu Lian who was reaping their benefits. When senior servant Zhong saw that Chu Lian really was going out in such a thin outfit, she quickly grabbed a fox fur-lined cloak from the nearby rack for Chu Lian to wear. Third young madam, it's already winter. You can't go out wearing so little, you'll freeze. Chu Lian quickly pushed the cloak aside. Was senior servant Zhong joking? How was she going to run in such a thick cloak? Momo, don't worry. I'll be fine. It's just a little cold. Once I start running later, I won't even feel a thing. After saying so, she quickly strode out of her bedroom, ignoring how senior servant Zhong was shouting and running after her with the fur-lined cloak. When she reached the outside, the cold air attacked her from the front. Chu Lian rubbed her arms and breathed out white puffs of air as she started running around the boundaries of her courtyard. When senior servant Zhong saw that third young madam had really started running around outside dressed in such thin clothing, she was about to continue chasing after third young madam. However, she was held back by Wenlan, who had just come out from the parlor. What are you holding me back for? Why don't you chase after third young madam and stop her? The matriarch and countess are already unwell. What will we do if something happens to third young madam as well? Wenlan pressed her lips together and shook her head. She was a martial arts practitioner herself, so she knew better than the old servant did. She replied coolly, Momo, third young madam will be fine. Running like this is good for her body. Just relax, Momo. Go and check on breakfast in the kitchen and give the cloak to me. I'll stay here and look after third young madam. When senior servant Zhong saw that she couldn't win against Chu Lian and Wenlan, she stomped her foot before shoving the cloak into Wenlan's arms and storming off in a huff. Chu Lian hadn't done any sort of physical exercise for far too long. After a short period of running, she started panting. She slowed down and tried to adjust her breathing. Actually, she had already thought it over last night. Her thought process was simple. Since she had decided to go to the northern border herself, then she had to make sure her body was in the best condition possible. Back in the modern world, she had learned enough that she understood how important a strong and healthy body was. Now that she had decided to make the long journey, she had to do her best to strengthen her body first. She had heard that it would get extremely cold after passing north of the Longxing Basin. The temperatures there couldn't be compared to those in the capital. Some of the older and more experienced servants in the estate had mentioned that simply spitting a mouthful of saliva could make icicles form. Chu Lian's body was just too weak right now. She might not even make it past the Longxing Basin, let alone the rest of the journey north. Whether it was helping with the war in the north or searching for the Snow Mountain Mist's flower, time was of the essence. Without a strong body, she would only become a burden for House Jing'an if she went to the northern border. As these thoughts passed through her head, the determination in Chu Lian's heart grew even more. Chapter 273, Preparations, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. A moment later, Wenlan had actually changed into appropriate clothing and began to follow her on her jog. Chu Lian couldn't understand what she was doing. She shot a questioning look at the silly girl. Wenlan pursed her lips before replying, "Third young madam, this servant will accompany you." Chu Lian smiled and nodded. When she felt that she had reached her limit, Chu Lian gradually slowed down and let Wenlan help her into the gym. Eventually, Wenlan's curiosity got the best of her. "Third young madam, why did you suddenly think of jogging? Are you thinking of learning Kung Fu?" Chu Lian was taken aback. She took a moist towel from Xian to wipe the sweat on her forehead before turning to Wenlan. Initially, Chu Lian shook her head, but then she changed her mind and nodded instead. In the end, she could only verbally explain, "I'm only thinking of learning some basic moves to keep my body healthy and defend myself." Chu Lian's thoughts were usually out of the norm anyway, so Wenlan didn't think much of it. She paused before offering, "Since third young madam has such intentions, would third young madam like this servant to teach you a few self-defense moves?" Chu Lian wanted to slap her leg in realization. How could she have forgotten that Wenqing and Wenlan knew martial arts? Although she had learned a few self-defense moves in the modern world, how could that compare to Wenqing and Wenlan's actual skills? With them as her teachers, although she might not be able to take on 5 people at once, she might at least have some ability to defend herself against some ruffians if needed. Thus, the period when Chu Lian normally went to visit matriarch was converted into morning practice. This continued on for quite a few days. Chu Lian would get up early in the morning before dawn and eat something light before jogging around her courtyard. Next, she would learn some basic moves from Wenqing and Wenlan in the gym. An hour later, she would have her breakfast before going to visit matriarch at Qingxi Hall. Every day, a guard from Prince Jin's estate would come to the Jing'an estate to report some news about the northern border. As matriarch's expression turned ever more serious, Changqi was out from dawn till dusk, listening for more information about the war. The court was still at a loss for what to do. Finally, the day came when matriarch could no longer sit still and do nothing. She patted Chu Lian's hand and ordered senior servant Zhou to summon Changqi. Chu Lian observed her expression. Her eyes darted about in thought before she finally said, "Grandmother, are you thinking of sending eldest brother to the northern border?" Matriarch turned to look at Chu Lian in surprise. She hesitated for a moment before showing a bitter smile. "So Lianer has come to the same conclusion as grandmother. The court hasn't been able to think of a solution, but our He family can't just sit back and do nothing. As long as there's still a shred of hope, I won't give up." Sanlang. Sanlang's still so young. He's only 20. There were already far too few descendants of House Jing'an. They had been succeeded by a single son generation after generation, and it wasn't until Changdi's generation that they had finally gotten 3 male descendants. It was already a huge regret that old Count Jing'an had died on the battlefield. Now, other than Daolong, the other sons were all in the military somehow. Sanlang had just gotten married not too long ago and he didn't have any sons to carry on his branch. How could matriarch bear to see that child sacrifice himself just like that? Matriarch's old eyes turned red and teary. Chu Lian gulped before saying, "Grandmother, let me go to the northern border." The matriarch's tears hadn't even dripped out of her eyes yet. She was instantly frightened by Chu Lian's words. As she stared at Chu Lian in shock, she said, "Sanlang's wife, what are you saying?" Chu Lian looked at matriarch earnestly. Her almond-shaped eyes were shining brightly like the stars in the sky, filled with an indomitable spirit. She repeated her words once more. Grandmother, let me go to the northern border. There's no better choice. Eldest brother has to take care of the estate and he can't leave the capital. Furthermore, he has a job at court to do. My two nieces are still young, too. The men of our house are all out, so eldest brother can't leave now. It was only now that matriarchy realized that Chu Lien was serious. She couldn't react for a moment before she reached out to grasp Chu Lien's hand, and in a heavy tone, she said, "You can't. How can we let a young girl like you go off to a wasteland like the northern border?" Chu Lien had already expected matriarchy's protest. She replied with as gentle a tone as she could muster. Grandmother, you're an exceptional woman yourself. Didn't you follow grandfather to Xinjiang when you were younger? You're the one who knows the best how we women aren't any less capable than the men. When the time comes, we can hold up our half of the sky. Furthermore, we're not the ones who can decide whether eldest brother can leave the capital or not, it's the emperor. Although matriarchy hadn't been born into a military family, after getting married to old Count Jing'an, she had followed him to the border at Xinjiang. Chu Lien had heard her mother-in-law Countess Jing'an mention that matriarchy had been extremely clever when she was younger and that she had been old Count Jing'an's little strategist. Many times, when they had been fighting to death with the Xinjiang people, it was thanks to matriarchy's schemes that old Count Jing'an had achieved victory by the skin of his teeth. Chu Lien's words reminded matriarchy of one thing. The sons of the He family were all stationed out of the estate. He Daolong hadn't taken a post in the capital purely out of consideration for the He family's next generation, it was mostly due to the emperor's wishes. Count Jing'an was a general defending one of the country's borders and there was a law that stated that father and son couldn't be in the same army. If He Daolong wanted to succeed the family title and responsibilities, he would have to wait for Count Jing'an to retire from Mingzhou. Furthermore, as the eldest son, the main reason that He Changqi had stayed behind in the capital was to act as a hostage to keep the emperor reassured of their family's loyalty. Since He Daolong had such a status, how could he leave the capital? Chapter 274, Setting Off, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When matriarchy heard Chu Lien's explanation, she sunk into silence. In her heart, she knew that Chu Lien was right. She just wasn't willing to face the truth. Chu Lien didn't want to force her into making a decision, so she softened her tone. Grandmother, let's wait until eldest brother comes back. We can discuss this with eldest brother. Matriarchy nodded with a grave expression on her face. It took He Changqi an hour to rush back to the estate. Once he passed the main entrance, he hurried over to Qingxi Hall. When He Changqi looked up and saw that Chu Lien was present as well, he seemed slightly surprised. Matriarchy pointed at the chair next to her. Take a seat and rest for a while before we speak. Mu Xiang served some tea to He Changqi. However, he only managed to finish half of it before he could no longer sit still. He set down the teacup and said with a serious face, Grandmother, what if I plead with the emperor and ask him to allow me to go to the northern border? Matriarchy was an exception amongst women. She had experienced great upheavals and changes when she was younger. As they waited for He Changqi to arrive, she had continued to think on the matter and came to a conclusion. Sanlang's wife was right. Daolong couldn't leave the capital, so they would have to depend on Sanlang's wife for this trip to the north. After she heard Daolong out, matriarchy shook her head. Daolong, you know the situation our family is in now. The emperor will never agree to let you leave the capital. But our He family can't just watch Sanlang fall into danger without doing anything. This old woman has already decided. We'll send Sanlang's wife out to the north. What? He Changqi's shout was full of disbelief and surprise. When he realized that his reaction had been a little over the top, he coughed awkwardly and cast a suspicious glance at Chu Lian, who was sitting beside Matriarch He. "Grandmother, this isn't fitting. Third sister-in-law is only 15 and she's a girl. How can we send her to a place as cold as the northern border? What will we do if something happens?" Matriarch He's expression hardened. "So what if she's a girl? So what if she's only 15? Lianer managed to make Gillen Restaurant famous at the young age of 15. Are you able to do the same? What's more, this old woman followed your grandfather all the way to Xinjiang when I was younger. At that time, I was only 16. Rest assured, we're not going to send her off right this instant. We're definitely going to prepare her as much as possible. I'll send some of our estate's secret guards to follow Lianer when it's time to go. She'll be fine." Although He Changqi looked like a rough, burly military official with all brawn and no wits, he was actually very aware of the overall situation. Seeing how decisively grandmother had spoken, he had already guessed that grandmother had already made her decision earlier. He also knew that he couldn't leave the capital that easily. However, as he looked at his young and fragile third sister-in-law, He Changqi couldn't help but inwardly sigh. Could such a small girl really bear these great responsibilities? The mission was to head to the northern border to send help to Sanlang. At the most critical time, she might even have to use all the resources at her disposal to rescue Sanlang. This required both wisdom and foresight. It wasn't going to be as easy as opening a restaurant and cooking up some dishes. He Changqi lamented once again in his heart. He regretted sorely how he hadn't discovered He Sanlang's desire to go to the north earlier. If he had known, he would have stopped him on the spot. "Since grandmother is already decided, I have nothing to say. However, your grandson has a request." "Speak." "I will send someone to help out on this trip to the north. If third sister-in-law can't give out orders in the spur of the moment, my representative will make the decisions for her." Upon hearing He Changqi's words, Chu Lian paused before looking at her eldest brother-in-law. Actually, to tell it straight, He Changqi didn't trust in her capabilities at all. However, that was a normal reaction. Although He Changqi hadn't been very successful in managing his marriage, he was a responsible and careful person. If not for the identity of House Jingyin's eldest son binding him here, he would have definitely become a brave and wise general in the military. Matriarch He cast a glance at Chu Lian. Seeing that she hadn't gotten angry because of He Changqi's words, she laid her worries to rest. Although Matriarch He hadn't said it out loud, she had also thought of the same possibility that He Changqi was trying to prevent. Chu Lian's calm demeanor gave Matriarch He the feeling that she could rely on this young, tender granddaughter-in-law of hers. Of course, it's natural for eldest brother to make such a request. If I fail to help husband myself, I can't be a burden to others trying to help him. Husband's safety is the most important. He Changqi hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so level-headed and rational. If it were some other family's young wife, they would have cried themselves to sleep in their own courtyard. How would they have thought of personally going out to save their husband? After a moment of stunned surprise, He Changqi nodded and had nothing left to say. The preparations were left for Matriarch He and He Changqi to make. The next day, Matriarch He sent her token to the palace and requested a meeting with the Empress Dowager. Just 2 days later, the Empress Dowager's imperial decree was sent out, ordering honored Lady Jeannie to bring the cotton-padded clothes and blankets that had been donated by the citizens of the capital to support the warriors fighting in the extreme cold of the northern border. Actually, this was just a cover-up for Matriarch He's real request to the Empress Dowager. No one had actually collected donations from the citizens. The supplies had been prepared by House Jingyan themselves to perpetuate the lie. He Changqi had already notified Prince Jin. The prince had sent a reply back, saying that he would send some men on the trip as well. The most surprising thing was that Princess Wei had somehow gotten wind of the news too. She personally visited the Jingyan estate along with Royal Princess Duanjia to see Chu Lian. It wasn't just Chu Lian who was surprised by this. Even Matriarch He needed some time to recover from her shock. Chapter 275, Setting Off, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia held on to Chu Lian's arm, trying to persuade her not to go to the northern border. While the two of them were talking inside her bedroom, Matriarch He was entertaining Princess Wei in the parlor outside. Chu Lu, are you crazy? Are you really going to Liangzhou? I heard my big brother say that you can't even stick out your hands over there, or else they'll freeze. Chu Lian noticed Royal Princess Duanjia's tightly furrowed brows. Her eyes were full of worry. Chu Lian smiled. Princess, the matriarch has already requested this from the Empress Dowager. I have to go. Royal Princess Duanjia immediately stood up, indignant. How can that old woman force you like that? Just tell me now. If you really don't want to go, this princess will go and plead with grandmother, the Empress Dowager, right now. Chu Lian hurriedly tugged the agitated Royal Princess Duanjia back down. She held on to the princess's arm and shook it. Princess, it's not like that, I wanted to go myself. You. Chu Lu. You're trying to anger me to death. Royal Princess Duanjia's chest heaved up and down in her frustration. Finally, she turned her head and refused to pay attention to Chu Lian. Chu Lian was at a loss for what to do. She could only try to patiently explain her rationale. Princess, He Sanlang is facing danger in the north. Our family can't just sit back and do nothing. Eldest brother can't leave the capital and second brother is away in the next city on imperial business. The only one who can leave the estate is me. Also, if I'm the one to go, we won't alert the enemy. We might even be able to snatch a victory if an opportunity comes along. Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes without any consideration for Chu Lian's feelings. Chu Lu, you don't even know a single martial arts move. What can you do if you go there? Chu Lian didn't intend to hide anything from Royal Princess Duanjia. She admitted, actually, I don't know what I can do. But if I don't go and something happens to He Sanlang, I won't be able to live with myself. Looking at Matriarch He and eldest brother's preparations, they weren't hoping for any miracles from her. She was just meant to be a cover for the He family to send resources to save Sanlang. Royal Princess Duanjia knew that she couldn't convince Chu Lian, so she stomped hard on the floor. Full of dissatisfaction, she said, "What did that He Sanlang do in his previous life to marry a wife like you? Did he save the country or something? If I had met you earlier, I would have gotten my brother to marry you so you could be my sister-in-law." When Chu Lian heard Royal Princess Duanjia speak so carelessly, the corners of her mouth twitched. This princess was really daring in her choice of words. Princess. What? Are you unhappy because I'm dissing He Sanlang? He's a good-for-nothing in the first place. What are you defending him for? See, that title of yours had nothing to do with him. When Royal Princess Duanjia wanted to insult people, she went all the way. Luckily, He Changdi wasn't here. Otherwise, he might have choked on his anger and died. When the princess saw that Chu Lian hadn't answered her and was just looking down and sipping her honey water, Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly sucked in her breath. She moved closer to Chu Lian and said, "Chu Lu, have you really fallen in love with that He Sanlang?" Chu Lian was speechless. She didn't understand how Royal Princess Duanjia's mind could leap to conclusions like that. Why was she suddenly asking about the feelings between her and her husband? When Chu Lian only looked up and blinked at her, Royal Princess Duanjia became more anxious. "Chu Lu. How could you be so silly? Are you made of putty? That stupid man abandoned you 5 days into your marriage, but you've actually set your heart on going to the northern border to save him from danger. If it were me, I wouldn't even care if he lived or not. It would be best if he just died. This princess can still take another husband. Chu Lian almost spit out the honey water in her mouth thanks to Royal Princess Duanjia's outrageous words. She didn't ignore Royal Princess Duanjia's complaints and replied frankly, I'm not going to the northern border just for He Sanlang. It's more for the sake of House Jing'an, since I'm the third young madam of House Jing'an first and foremost. As long as House Jing'an is doing well, I'll be able to live my days well, too. It was only when Royal Princess Duanjia heard Chu Lian's reply that she turned quiet. She stopped refuting Chu Lian and remained silent for a moment. Finally, she looked up and met Chu Lian's eyes. Chu Lu, you have to be careful when you go to the northern border. I'll ask my father to send some guards to protect you. Chu Lian smiled. Princess, it's not as dangerous as you think. I'm not going to the army camp, so why would anything happen to me? At most, I'll be staying in Liangzhou City for a while. Oh yes, didn't you say you wanted to eat hot pot some time ago? Why don't we eat hot pot together today since we have the chance? Although saliva had already began to pool in her mouth, Royal Princess Duanjia still rolled her eyes at Chu Lian. She complained, Chu Lu, you're still thinking about food at this time. Chu Lian made a pft sound. So Princess doesn't want to eat hot pot. Then I'll tell Xian and the rest to stop preparing it. Just as Chu Lian was about to stand up and do exactly that, Royal Princess Duanjia tugged on her sleeve and said, Chu Lu. Since you want to eat hot pot, then this princess will do you a favor and accompany you for a meal. Chu Lian covered her smile and shot a look at Royal Princess Duanjia. As expected, once food was mentioned, Royal Princess Duanjia had been successfully distracted. In an instant, she had already started to ask more questions. How was hot pot made? Could they really put all sorts of food in to cook? Would it still taste good that way? After the meal, Princess Wei grasped Chu Lian's hand and nagged at her for a long time. It wasn't until after 2 p.m. that Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia finally went home in a low-key manner. The situation in the north could change at any moment, so House Jing'an didn't dare to tarry. They quickly set the date for Chu Lian's departure to the north. Very coincidentally, it happened to be the day of Xiao Bojian's appreciation banquet in the Ying estate. TL note, hot pot is one of my fave foods even though I live on an ever-sunny island and I don't actually have to keep warm in winter lol. Amazing spread of hot pot dishes, cool looking and spicy hot pot. My personal fave, marbled Japanese beef dipped in a simple kelp broth or sukiyaki broth, shabu shabu wagyu beef. Chapter 276, Retribution, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. To travel from the capital to the northern border, most common folk and merchants would choose to use the government-built highway. The highway passed through many important towns and cities and it was very convenient for doing business or taking a break on the road. However, because Chu Lian and her party were rushing to the northern border, they couldn't take any detours on the road. Furthermore, they were traveling light. Other than the few carriages of cotton clothes and blankets, they didn't have to take any heavy loads into consideration. Thus, after Matriarch He and He Changqi had a discussion with the private soldiers serving their family, they chose a small road that led to Liangzhou. The small road cut straight into the hinterland of the northern border from the outskirts of the capital. There weren't any small villages they could rest in along the way, and there might even be stretches of days where there wouldn't be any water sources nearby. For the most part, they would be traveling through mountain forests, but that meant they would have to have enough supplies or some skilled hunters as part of their entourage. Otherwise, it would be hard to reach the northern border. However, they could save a lot of time traveling on a small road like this as long as they had a good horse under them. It would only take around 10 to 20 days to reach Liangzhou from the capital, and it would cut their travel time by 2/3 as compared to the highway. As the day of her departure grew closer and closer, Chu Lian didn't dare to waste a single second of her time. She continued waking up before the sun was up to practice. She was now extremely familiar with the few moves that Wenqing and Wenlan had taught her for self-defense. She also went over to Great Dr. Miao's to ask for some preventives and also for medicines that could cure the most common wounds. Great Dr. Miao was very generous towards Chu Lian and packed up a bundle for her that included a bottle each of poison antidotes, bug repellent, and even frostbite and burn salves. Chu Lian also passed Manager Qin a list of things and had him prepare everything on the list for her. The day before departure, 2 guards came from Prince Wei's estate, saying that they were sent by Princess Wei to protect Chu Lian's safety on the trip. The guards were a pair of siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. The man was called Li Xing while the woman was called Li Yu. The 2 siblings looked similar, both dressed in a guard's uniform from the prince's estate with their heads lowered respectfully. It was the first time Chu Lian had met them, so she didn't know what their personalities were like. Since Princess Wei had sent them specially for her, Chu Lian couldn't reject them. She told Xian to bring the 2 guards to a room so they could rest. When it was finally the day of departure, Chu Lian had already finished packing all of her luggage. Prince Jin sent a small team of men and horses, about 20 people in all. The leader was a young man called Tang Yan. Tang Yan had already seen Chu Lian before, but this was the first time that Chu Lian had seen him. Tang Yan walked up to Chu Lian. When he saw the things piled up inside the carriage, his jaw almost dropped from shock. He first bowed towards Chu Lian and gave a simple self-introduction before gaping as he asked, Is this all of honored lady's luggage? Chu Lian nodded while standing next to the carriage, a calm expression on her face. It is. Is there any problem, Sir Tang? Tang Yan opened his mouth as if wanting to speak. In the end, he couldn't resist giving her a reminder. Actually, honored lady, you don't have to bring so many things. Your estate has already informed His Highness that we're going to be using a small road, so this subordinate has already ordered the men to prepare enough food and supplies. We've also brought a doctor and a cook along. Chu Lian looked at him and then tilted her head. Then could Sir Tang tell us how many carriages of goods we're bringing on this trip? At least 9 to 10. Chu Lian nodded. Since that's so, it won't be much to bring along one more carriage. Furthermore, these are just some day-to-day items that I'm used to using. They're just a few items, not worth a mention. Tang Yan didn't know how to reply to this statement. He cast a glance at the full carriage next to her. Wasn't that a small metal pot sticking out from the corner? He sweated and inwardly complained, how is that not worth a mention? She's even brought pots and pans along. This is going to be a harsh journey with very little food. Is she going to cook up some delicacies with that pot? When Chu Lian was about to leave, everyone in the estate except the grounded Madame Zhou and the bedridden Countess Jingyan came out to send her off. For this trip to the north, Chu Lian was going to bring Wenqing and Wenlan with her, as well as Manager Qin. The other people in the party were all arranged by matriarchy. She heard that matriarchy had also sent 2 secret bodyguards. However, they were to remain hidden and wouldn't appear except when needed. Other than that, there were also the 2 guards that Princess Wei had sent, Li Xing and Li Yu. In front of the estate's entrance, He Daolong was talking to Tang Yan while matriarchy took Chu Lian's hands in hers, unwilling to part. Lianer, it'll be hard on you for this trip to the north. You must take care of your own safety first and foremost. Grandmother, don't worry. I can take care of myself. I'm also bringing Wenqing and Wenlan. It's grandmother who should take better care of your health. When granddaughter-in-law returns home with husband, I want to see a bright and healthy grandmother. Matriarchy nodded, her eyes slightly moist. She patted Chu Lian's hand and tucked away some stray strands of hair for her before urging her to get onto the carriage. Chapter 277, Retribution, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Standing off to one side, senior servant Gui's eyes were already red. She had raised Chu Lian and followed her all the way to her husband's household. This was the first time that she was going to be separated from her. If only she had been a few years younger, then she might have followed along with or without Chu Lian's permission. Chu Lian stepped onto the carriage and turned back to look. When she saw that senior servant Gui had come out with Xian to chase after her, she felt the corners of her eyes turn a little wet as well. Chu Lian shouted, "Momo, Xian, go back." Senior servant Gui covered her mouth with a handkerchief before nodding forcefully, "Third young madam, don't worry. This old servant will take good care of Songtao Court for you." Chu Lian turned around and stopped looking back. She stepped forcefully onto the step and boarded the carriage. Then she was seen no more as the felt curtain fell over the entrance, blocking the wind and all the gazes of the crowd. House Jing'an's private troops and Tang Yan's team quickly disappeared from House Jing'an's entrance. It wasn't until they could no longer see any of the party that He Changqi personally escorted Matriarch He back into the estate. Half a day after Chu Lian had left, in the afternoon, a messy-haired, crazy-looking woman stumbled over to the normally peaceful entrance of the Jing'an estate. Her hair was a complete mess and her face was covered in dirt, making her unrecognizable. She lurched over to the Jing'an estate's entrance and tried to enter, but how could the manservant guarding the door let her in just like that? He kicked her to the ground. Where did this crazy woman come from? Hey, can't you see where this is? How dare you try to charge into the estate? Are you sick of living? The messy-haired woman laid on the floor, groaning in pain. After a moment, she started shouting, "Quick, notify third young madam. I'm third young madam's handmaid." "Right, I'm a handmaid who married over with third young madam. Quick, notify third young madam for me." The door guard looked at her in contempt. "TCH, you're just a miserable lying wretch. Trying to impersonate a handmaid of one of our noble madams. Why don't you take a look in the mirror first? Let me tell you, I've seen all the handmaids serving our third young madam before. Not a single one of them looks like you." When the woman heard the door guard's disdainful words, her expression almost cracked. She crawled off the ground and tried to pull at the hem of his clothes. She even brushed aside the messy hair covering her face, revealing her looks. Unfortunately, her face was still covered in dirt. The hand she used to grasp at the manservant was also covered in rotting sores. "Look at my face. Look at my face. I'm one of honored Lady Jeannie's handmaids. It was third young madam who gave me my name. I'm Ming Yen. My name is Ming Yen. Please, go in and notify third young madam for me. Please." The manservant was completely disgusted by her blackened face and sore-covered hands. How could he bother with discerning her looks? He kicked Ming Yen away again with an expression full of loathing. "Stupid beggar. Stop acting. If you continue like this, I'll get the city guards to come over and throw you into jail." The manservant harumphed inwardly. The only handmaids serving third young madam were called Xian, Fuyan, and Jingyan. There was also Miss Wenqing. When had there ever been some Mingyan? Did this person really think that she could bluff her way into the Jingyan estate just by giving herself a name ending with Yen? How could Mingyan possibly give up her last chance at survival? Even though her body was already weak, she found the last remnants of her strength and stumbled forward a few steps. She grabbed onto the door guard's calf and pleaded, "Please. Please. Just let me meet third young madam, just once. As long as you help me pass a message to her, I'll give you whatever you want." Alright, I know third young madam's secret recipes. If you send a message for me, I'll tell them to you. I'll give them all to you. The manservant was already at the limits of his disgust thanks to this crazy woman. This time, he showed no mercy and called over 2 others to pull away the madwoman hugging his leg. They forcefully removed her and tossed her down the steps in front of the estate's entrance. The door guard had one last parting remark for her. Let me tell you, even if you really know third young madam, you're too late. Our third young madam received an imperial edict to go to the north, and she's already left. After that, he stopped bothering with the madwoman. He ordered the 2 retainers to beat the woman to death with some rods if she dared to get close to the entrance again. Mingyan's dull eyes widened, her expression filled with disbelief. She shook her head in denial. How could it be? How was that possible? Third young madam went to the north. How could that be? If third young madam was no longer in the estate, then who was going to save her life? No matter how much Mingyan tried, she wasn't able to enter the Jingyan estate. In the end, the guards tossed her into one of the corners outside the estate. Mingyan hugged her knees to herself and curled up where she was. The cold invaded her body, stealing away her warmth and making her stiff with frost. In her mind, she couldn't help but think back to the days she had lived with Chu Lian in Songtao Court. Third young madam had been so friendly, and she had never mistreated any of her servants. Although third young master wasn't around, the servants of Songtao Court could always walk around with straight backs. Third young madam had bestowed golden hairpins and rings on her handmaids. Those designs were so pretty. It had been her first time seeing such beautiful jewelry in her life. What a pity that it was all gone. Someone else had taken them from her. Third young madam had never avoided her handmaids when making one of her secret recipes. She would even teach them a little more when she was happy. Once, Mingyan had made a gamble and asked third young madam for some dessert recipes. Third young madam hadn't gotten mad in the slightest and patiently instructed her. And after the first time she explained it, third young madam had even asked if the steps were clear enough. The secret recipes she had learned from third young madam had become hers. If those people wanted to steal them for themselves, even if her hands rotted away, she wasn't going to reveal third young madam's secret recipes to anyone. As Mingyan's thoughts ran through her head, she looked up at the high wall of the estate behind her. How she wished that she hadn't been possessed by greed back then. Chapter 278, The Passing of a Woman, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. That stubborn and loyal Xian had still ended up with a better fate than hers, Mingyan felt like she was immersed in the middle of an ice-covered lake. Although there was still a tiny bit of warmth left in her chest, it felt like a flickering candle flame, slowly shrinking and fading away. She leaned against the cold wall behind her, the memories from the Jing estate swirling in her mind. Old Duke Sheng's visits to Gillen Restaurant had become more and more frequent. A month after Gillen Restaurant had opened, the old Duke was having all his meals at the restaurant apart from breakfast. Chu Lian had specially reserved a small court in Gillen Restaurant for old Duke Sheng. As long as he went over there at meal times, he didn't need to queue at all and he would be able to eat any of the dishes in Gillen Restaurant. Ever so slowly, old Duke Sheng started to feel that Mingyan's dishes weren't as appetizing as before. One day, after old Duke Sheng had come back to the estate, old Duchess Sheng asked her husband what he would like to eat at night. Old Duke Sheng had just casually replied with top-grade hot pot. He had eaten that dish at Gillen Restaurant in the afternoon and it was one of the restaurant's new dishes for the month. He had only eaten it once before, so he hadn't had enough. The answer he gave his wife came entirely from his subconscious. The old cooks in the Jing estate were pretty much useless by now. It was mostly Mingyan who was in charge of old Duke Sheng's kitchen. Since old Duke Xing had made a request, the responsibility of actually making the dish fell onto Mingyan's shoulders. Due to the fact that she would chase everyone out whenever she cooked in the kitchen, the servants in the kitchen were already biased against her. After old Duke Xing had requested this completely foreign dish, no one was willing to speak up for her. Mingyan was almost dancing on the spot from her anxiety. She didn't know how to make this top-grade hot pot at all. Back then, she had started hating Chu Lian. Why hadn't Chu Lian taught her a few more secret recipes? If she had, then she wouldn't be in this desperate state right now. Of course, she wasn't able to make the top-grade hot pot. Mingyan was summoned by old Duchess Xing and suffered a harsh scolding. It wasn't until she was kneeling before the old Duchess that Mingyan finally realized she was at the end of her path. Thus, she started thinking up a scheme for her own survival. Zheng would come over to old Duke Sheng's courtyard every morning for breakfast. She used that chance to slip some drugs into his food. However, before Zheng had even touched the drug-laced food, a maidservant had already reported Mingyan's actions to the younger Duchess Xing. The Xing estate only had this one heir, so he was absolutely precious to them. Duchess Xing kept watch over him tightly. When she found out that her son had almost been drugged by a maidservant, she exploded. Thus, Duchess Xing personally took over the punishment and had Mingyan beaten until she was half dead. After that, she ordered the servants to buy some drugs that could make her hands lame so she would never cook again. There was no shortage of skeletons in the closet behind the tall walls of the inner court. While the matriarchs of noble families were elegant and poised on the outside, their hands were likely stained with the blood of countless people. Duchess Xing was not a soft-hearted matriarch. Furthermore, Mingyan was just a servant. As favored as she was still just a servant who could cook a little. In the eyes of most masters, she was no different than a dog. While Mingyan was being punished, old Duke Xing didn't even try to plead for mercy for her. In the end, Mingyan used all her savings to bribe the maidservant guarding the entrance so she could escape from the Xing estate. The first person she had thought to seek help from was Chu Lian. Unfortunately, she was never going to be able to meet her again. As the last vestiges of warmth faded from Mingyan's heart, the soft glow of the afternoon sun shone upon her head. The next day, Xian led a few maidservants out from the side entrance on an errand to Gillen Restaurant. The moment she stepped out, she noticed the broken body lying in a corner outside the estate. The menial servant guarding the door noticed Xian's frown and quickly tried smiling in a placating manner. "Miss Xian, that's just a lunatic. She kept fussing and trying to enter the estate yesterday, claiming that she's one of third young madam's handmaids. In the end, the guards at the entrance beat her up and threw her out. She crawled into that corner herself. Maybe she's already lost the little bit of life left in her." Handmaid. A bad premonition surfaced in Xian's heart. She quickly ordered for 2 manservants to come. By the time they checked the body, the woman was no longer breathing. When the manservant pulled aside the messy hair covering the woman's face, Xian sucked in a gasp of cold air. It really was Mingyan. Standing before a sister who had served together with her in the past, Xian's heart was filled with mixed emotions. She stood in silence for a long moment until the manservant next to her carefully asked, "Miss Xian, what should we do?" Xian took in a deep breath and suppressed the burgeoning emotions threatening to burst out of her. She took out a silver ingot from her sleeve and passed it to the manservant. "Buy a coffin and bury her." Mingyan had been part of the dowry when Chu Lian had married into the Jing'an estate. Before that, she had just been a newly bought servant who had no parents or relatives. Xian cast one last look at that cold, stiff body before leading her party away without another look back. Mingyan had chosen her own path. The only person she could blame for her end was herself.